Hey, come on in. Pull the blanket a little closer. Set the phone down. Just for a moment, well, not yet, keep it a little longer. You'll need it to hit that like button in a second, but just breathe. You found this place. That already says something about you. You know what scientists discovered when they put people inside a brain scanner and told them to do absolutely nothing? The brain didn't rest. It actually lit up. It started working harder. And not on stress, not on tasks, not on the email you forgot to answer. It started working on you, on making sense of your feelings, your memories, your sense of who you are in the world. The brain has a secret life. It only lives when you stop demanding things of it. And here is the strange, quiet truth that most people spend their whole lives never knowing the moments when you feel most like yourself, the ones that feel warm, held safe. Those moments are not accidents. They are not luck. They are your nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do when you finally let it. Tonight, we are going to talk about that, about the hidden science of feeling okay, about what your brain is actually doing when it finally exhales, about the psychology of peace, not as a luxury, not as a reward you have to earn, but as something woven into the very architecture of what you are. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of thing you want more of in your life, the slow kind, the thoughtful kind, the kind that actually makes you feel something good before you fall asleep, go ahead and give this video a like. Subscribe if you haven't yet. And if you feel like it, drop a comment. Tell me where you are right now, what time it is, what brought you here tonight. I genuinely love reading those. There's something beautiful about thousands of people all over the world, in their beds, in their quiet living rooms, in cities I've never visited, all choosing the same soft landing at the same time. Now, dim whatever light you can. If you have a fan, going even better. That low, steady hum does something to the nervous system we'll actually get to later. And let's begin. Here is where I want to start, with the moment it all changes. Not the dramatic kind of moment, not a crisis, not a revelation. Just a Tuesday evening sometime in the 1980s, in a small laboratory at the University of Wisconsin, where a researcher named Richard Davidson was watching brain scans and quietly realizing that everything he thought he knew about human emotion was wrong. Davidson had been trained to think of emotions the way most scientists did at the time, as reactions. Something happens, you feel something, it passes. Simple as that. But the scans in front of him told a different story. He was looking at two types of people. One group showed consistent, intense activity on the left side of the prefrontal cortex, just behind the forehead. The other group showed more activity on the right. And what he found slowly, and then undeniably, was that the left-leaning group reported feeling more calm, more grounded, more capable of bouncing back from difficulty. Not happier in a giddy way, just steadier. The other group described their inner world with words like anxious, overwhelmed, stuck. And here is the part that changed things. Davidson started wondering if that pattern was fixed. If you were born a right-side person, were you just unlucky? Were some people simply wired for unease? The answer, it turned out, was no. But we'll come back to Davidson. First, I want you to picture something older, much older. Imagine a village, somewhere on the coast of what is now southern France, roughly 30,000 years ago. It is night. A fire burns low at the center of a group of people who are in almost every neurological way identical to you. Their brains run on the same chemistry. Their bodies respond to threat and safety with the same cascade of signals yours does. They feel fear the same way you do. They feel relief the same way. And on this particular night, after the hunting, after the children are settled, after the work of surviving another day is done, they do something that every human culture in history has done without being taught. They sit together. They breathe slowly. They tell each other stories. Psychologists have a name for what was happening around that fire, though they didn't coin the term until much later. They call it co-regulation. It is the process by which two or more nervous systems synchronize with one another and in doing so become calmer than any one of them could become alone. It is why you sleep better when someone you love is nearby. It is why a phone call from a close friend can change the chemistry of your blood within minutes. It is why sitting in a room full of calm people makes you feel calm even if no one speaks. Your nervous system is not a closed system. It was never meant to be. The polyvagal theory developed by neuroscientist Stephen Porges in the 1990s gave the scientific world a language for something humans had always known in their bodies. Porges identified a branch of the vagus nerve, a long, winding nerve that connects your brain to your heart, your lungs, and your gut, that he called the ventral vagal system. When this system is active, you feel open, connected, safe, not euphoric, not buzzing with energy, just genuinely quietly. Okay, it is the physiological state of a person sitting around a fire with people they trust. And the opposite of that state is not anger. It is not fear exactly. It is something subtler and more exhausting. It is the constant low-grade hum of a nervous system that cannot find its way back to safe. A system scanning, always scanning, for the next thing to be worried about. A system that forgot or was never taught how to rest. Most of us live there more than we realize. Here is a fact that I find genuinely astonishing, and I want you to sit with it for a moment. A study published in the journal Science back in 2010 asked over 2,000 people to report at random moments throughout their day what they were doing, whether their mind was wandering, and how happy they felt. The results were striking in the most unexpected way. People reported that their minds were somewhere other than what they were doing 47% of the time. Nearly half of every waking hour, they were mentally elsewhere, worrying about something that hadn't happened, replaying something that had, planning, rehearsing, regretting. And in almost every case, when the mind was wandering, the person reported feeling less happy than when it was present. Even, and this is the part that genuinely stunned the researchers, even when the thing they were doing was something neutral or mildly unpleasant. Being fully present in a boring task made people feel better than being mentally absent during a pleasant one. The mind, it turns out, hates uncertainty more than it dislikes discomfort. A wandering mind is almost always a worried mind, and a worried mind is a tired mind. So what brings it back? This is where psychology and ancient wisdom start talking over each other like two people who just realized they've been saying the same thing in different languages. Because the practices that modern neuroscience now recommends for calming an overstimulated nervous system are in almost every case things that human beings have been doing for thousands of years without needing a study to tell them why. Slow breathing, repetitive rhythmic movement, warmth, darkness, the sound of another voice telling a story, the feeling of being held even metaphorically inside a narrative that is larger than your daily troubles. In the Tang dynasty of China, around the 7th century court, physicians prescribed what they called listening therapy to aristocrats suffering from what we would now recognize as anxiety disorders. The patient would lie still while a trusted voice told them long, slow, meandering stories, not exciting stories, not stories with dramatic endings, but stories about rivers, about seasons changing, about the patient lives of farmers and monks. The idea was not distraction. It was something more precise than that. It was the deliberate use of narrative to give the nervous system something safe to follow, the way you might offer your hand to someone who is shaking. They understood, without the vocabulary, what neuroscience has since confirmed, that the brain under stress is a brain looking for a pattern to trust. Give it one, and it will start to let go. Now back to Richard Davidson, because his work didn't end with the discovery of left brain and right brain emotional tendencies. That was just the beginning. What he did next was collaborate with a group of Tibetan Buddhist monks, some of whom had spent tens of thousands of hours in meditation practice. And what his brain scans showed was something that rewrote the textbooks. Those monks had prefrontal cortex activity unlike anything Davidson had seen in a standard population. Levels of left side activation that, by his existing scale, were essentially off the charts. And what the monks reported feeling consistently was not bliss in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter, a baseline sense of being okay, a steadiness that held even during pain, even during difficulty, even when the world outside the monastery was loud and unpredictable. Davidson's conclusion, which he spent the next 2 decades defending and expanding, was this: the brain is far more changeable than we thought. The tendency toward calm is not a fixed inheritance. It is a skill, a capacity that can be built slowly, the same way any other ability is built through practice, through repetition, through the patient, persistent act of choosing again and again to return to a state of rest. What you are doing right now, by the way, counts. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way that makes a headline, but in the quiet, cumulative way that actually changes things. Every time you choose to slow down, every time you choose a soft story over a loud one, a gentle voice over a jarring one, stillness over the endless scroll, you are making a tiny deposit into an account that pays out in years, not minutes. The brain you are building tonight, by lying here and letting yourself be told something gentle and true, is slightly different from the brain you would have built by doing something else. And slightly is everything over time. This is the science of feeling safe. And we have barely scratched the surface, because what we haven't talked about yet is something that might surprise you: the strange and counterintuitive role that doing nothing plays in the brain's most important work. What happens in the quiet? What the mind does when it thinks no one is watching? There is an entire network inside your brain that only switches on when you stop trying. And what it builds during those moments scientists now believe may be the closest thing to a self that neuroscience has ever found. That is exactly where we're going next. So there it is, the secret the brain has been keeping from you. Not from malice, not from negligence, just because nobody thought to look. For most of the 20th century, neuroscientists treated the resting brain the way most of us treat a parked car, as something waiting idle, burning through fuel for no particular purpose. When research subjects lay still in the scanner with no task to perform, scientists essentially discarded that data. It was considered noise, background static, the brain between the real moments. And then sometime in the late 1990s, a researcher at Washington University named Marcus Rachel noticed something that stopped him cold. The brain wasn't quieter when people rested. It was louder. Specific regions were consuming more energy during rest than during almost any focused task. Not a little more significantly more. The medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the angular gyrus, these areas lit up together in a pattern so consistent, so reliable, that Rachel eventually gave it a name. He called it the default mode network, the brain's default, its factory setting, what it does when you leave it alone. The scientific community's first reaction, understandably, was something along the lines of, well, that's odd. The second reaction took a little longer, because once researchers started actually asking people what was going through their minds during those resting scans, really carefully asking, a portrait began to emerge of what the default mode network was actually doing. And it was not nothing. It was not random firing. It was, in a sense, the most human thing the brain does. It was telling itself stories. Think about what happens in the 30 seconds between setting down your phone and falling asleep. If you are like most people, your mind does not go blank. It goes somewhere. A memory surfaces, not necessarily a significant one. Sometimes something almost embarrassingly small, a conversation from years ago, the face of someone you haven't thought about in months. Then a feeling attaches to it, then a question, then something else entirely. It feels like drifting, like the mind wandering without purpose. But here is what Rachel and the researchers who followed him discovered: it has a purpose, a profound one. The default mode network, when left to its own devices, is doing the slow, patient work of making you coherent. It is connecting your past to your present. It is finding patterns across your experiences, extracting meaning, updating your understanding of who you are and how the world works. It is, in the most literal neurological sense, writing the ongoing story of your life. And it can only do that when you stop interrupting it. I want you to let that land for a moment, because I think it changes something. All those times you felt guilty for staring out the window, for sitting on the porch and not doing anything in particular, for lying in the bath a little longer than strictly necessary. Your brain was not being lazy. It was engaged in work that no amount of conscious effort can replicate, the kind of deep, slow integration that turns raw experience into actual wisdom. There is a reason that solutions to difficult problems so often arrive in the shower. Not because water is magical, though I understand if it feels that way, but because the shower is one of the few places in modern life where we still give our minds genuine, uninterrupted downtime. The default mode network kicks in. It roams freely through the architecture of everything you know. And sometimes, while it is doing that, it finds a connection you never would have forced your way to. A study published in the journal Psychological Science found that people who were given a demanding problem to solve, then told to rest, performed significantly better when they returned to the problem than people who had been working on it continuously the whole time. The resting group hadn't been thinking about the problem, at least not consciously, but something had, and it came back with answers. Now here is where history steps in, and I find this part quietly wonderful. Long before any of this had a name, before there were brain scanners or research journals or funding committees, certain human traditions had already arrived at the same conclusion. They just expressed it differently. In the monastic tradition of medieval Europe, particularly among the Benedictine order, founded in the 6th century by Benedict of Nursia, the daily schedule included something called Lectio Divina, sacred reading. But it was unlike any reading you might picture. It was not study, it was not comprehension. The monk would read a single passage, often just a few lines, then set the text aside and sit, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer, simply sitting with whatever the words had stirred, letting the mind move where it would. The point was not to analyze. The point was to let understanding arrive on its own, from below the way a spring finds its way up through stone. Benedictine monasteries across Europe produced over centuries some of the most remarkable scholars, artists, architects, and philosophers the Western world had ever seen. And their communities were structured almost obsessively around the rhythm of work and rest, noise and silence, engagement and withdrawal. They had no neuroscience, but they had something that neuroscience has only recently caught up to: a deep, practical respect for what the mind needs in order to work well. Have you ever noticed that your best thinking rarely happens at a desk? I ask because I think most of us have been taught somewhere along the way that productivity looks like intensity, that if you are not visibly straining, you are not really working. That rest is the opposite of achievement, rather than, as the evidence increasingly suggests, its foundation. We inherited this idea from somewhere, possibly from the Industrial Revolution, possibly from certain strains of Protestant work ethic that equated visible labor with moral worth, and we have carried it forward into an age where our most important work is cognitive, creative, and emotional, which is to say, exactly the kind of work that demands rest most urgently. The irony is almost too perfect. We live in the most sophisticated information society in human history, and we are systematically starving the one cognitive process that actually turns information into insight. Marcus Rachel spent years trying to get the default mode network taken seriously, and I have a quiet admiration for that particular kind of scientific stubbornness, because what he was essentially arguing was that the brain's most important work is invisible, that the moments science had been throwing away were the moments that mattered most, that the noise was the signal. He was right. Since his initial findings, the default mode network has been linked to something researchers call autobiographical memory, your sense of your own continuous history, the thread that connects who you were at 7 years old to who you are right now. It is also linked to theory of mind, the ability to imagine what other people are thinking and feeling, which is one of the foundations of empathy. And it is linked to future thinking, the capacity to imagine possibilities, to plan, to hope. When the default mode network is consistently disrupted or suppressed, as happens, researchers now believe, during chronic stress, during sleep deprivation, during the kind of relentless overstimulation that has become the baseline condition of modern life, these capacities begin to fray. People report feeling disconnected from themselves, emotionally flat, unable to imagine forward, unable to make sense of their own lives. That is not a personality problem. That is a brain that has been denied the time it needs to do its deepest work. There is a particular piece of history I keep returning to when I think about all of this. In 1854, a man named Henry David Thoreau went to live alone in a small cabin he built himself on the edge of a pond in Concord, Massachusetts. He stayed for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. He wrote, to live deliberately, to confront only the essential facts of life. What is less often discussed is what he actually did with his days. He walked, he sat, he watched the water. He wrote in his journal sometimes for hours, but often just a few lines, then set the pen down and thought. He received visitors. He cooked simple meals. By any modern metric, he was spectacularly unproductive. And yet Walden, the book that came from those years, has never gone out of print. It has been translated into dozens of languages. It shaped the thinking of Gandhi, of Martin Luther King Jr., of Leo Tolstoy, who wrote to Thoreau's legacy directly in his own moral philosophy. The ideas that grew out of 2 years of deliberate stillness rippled forward through a century and a half of human history. What was Thoreau doing on those long, slow mornings by the pond? He was, I would argue, doing exactly what the default mode network does when you give it room. He was letting experience become meaning. He was letting observation become understanding. He was letting the noise settle until he could hear what was underneath it. Now, I want to be careful here, because I am not suggesting that everyone needs to move to a cabin in the woods and abandon their responsibilities, though if that sounds appealing, I completely understand. What I am suggesting is something smaller and in some ways more radical, that the small pockets of genuine rest you carve out of your days are not wasted time. They are investment time. They are the hours in which your brain does the work that makes all the other hours coherent. Research from the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences found that people with more active default mode networks showed greater creativity, stronger social cognition, and better emotional regulation than those with less activity at rest. Not activity during tasks, activity during rest. The brain that plays, wanders, and digests during its quiet hours is the brain that performs better, connects better, and weathers difficulty better during its busy ones. There is also something tender in this idea that I want to name directly. For anyone who has ever felt guilty about needing rest, anyone who was told they were lazy or soft or not trying hard enough, the neuroscience is now quite clear. You are not wrong to need that. You were right. The people who said otherwise were working from an incomplete model of how human beings actually function. And you can let that particular piece of shame go tonight if you'd like. The science has your back. The default mode network doesn't care about deadlines. It doesn't care about your to-do list. It cares about one thing: being given enough quiet, enough space, enough uninterrupted time to do what it was built to do, which is to make you whole. And the beautiful, almost laughably simple truth is that you are doing it right now. Lying here listening, letting your attention soften at the edges. The network is active. The work is happening. Not despite the stillness, because of it. Which brings us to something I find almost paradoxical, and I say that as someone who has spent a long time thinking about why human beings do the things they do. Because if rest is this powerful, if stillness produces this much, then why is it so hard? Why do we resist it? Why does doing nothing feel, to so many people, like something they have to earn? The answer has everything to do with the hidden architecture of habit, with the way small rituals repeated over time can either wall us off from rest or build a path directly toward it. And the history of that is older and stranger and more personally relevant than you might expect. Ritual. The word sounds almost ceremonial, doesn't it? Like something that belongs in a cathedral or an ancient temple, or at the very least a cookbook with an unusually dramatic introduction. But strip away the grandeur, and what you are left with is something almost embarrassingly ordinary, a repeated action, done in a specific order at a specific time, until the doing of it becomes automatic. A cup of tea made the same way every morning. A particular route walked at the same hour. A book opened to the same page before sleep. Small things, almost laughably small sometimes, and yet the psychological literature on ritual is at this point overwhelming in one direction. These small repeated acts, the ones that might look from the outside like mere habit, like routine, like the slightly boring scaffolding of an unremarkable life, turn out to be among the most powerful tools the human mind possesses for managing anxiety, building resilience, and creating the conditions in which genuine rest becomes possible. The question is why? And the answer, it turns out, is older than psychology itself. Let me take you to the English countryside, specifically to a gravel path in the village of Down in Kent, winding through a stretch of woodland that Charles Darwin had planted himself. He called it his thinking path, or more affectionately the sandwalk, named for the sand he had spread across it to soften the sound of his own footsteps. Every single day without exception, Darwin walked that path. 5 loops in the morning, more if a problem was proving stubborn. He kept a pile of stones at one end, and he kicked one aside with each completed circuit so he didn't have to hold the number in his head. He walked the sandwalk while developing the theory of natural selection. He walked it while writing On the Origin of Species. He walked it on the days when the thinking was going well, and on the days when it wasn't, which he considered equally important. To Darwin, the walk was not a break from the work. It was the work. The regularity of it, the predictability of those 5 loops, the way the gravel sounded beneath his feet. At the same time every morning, these things were not incidental. They were load-bearing. They held something up. Now move forward about a century and cross the Channel to Königsberg in what was then Prussia, a city that has since changed its name and its flag and its language, but which in the late 18th century was home to a philosopher named Immanuel Kant, whose daily walk was so precisely timed that his neighbors reportedly set their clocks by it. He left his house at 3:30 in the afternoon. He walked the same route. He returned at the same time. Every day. For decades. Kant was by most accounts not a man who was trying to be charming about this. He was not performing picturesque eccentricity for the benefit of posterity. He was, I think, doing something very precise. He was using the predictability of the external world to stabilize the volatility of the internal one. Because philosophical thinking, real philosophical thinking, the kind that grapples with consciousness and morality and the nature of time, is not comfortable work. It generates tremendous internal noise. And Kant had figured out through long experience that he needed the external world to be utterly reliably quiet and consistent so that the internal world could be chaotic in productive ways. This is not a coincidence, by the way. Darwin and Kant are not outliers. When the researcher Mason Curry spent years cataloging the daily routines of over 160 creative geniuses, composers, novelists, painters, scientists, philosophers, for his book Daily Rituals, published in 2013, a pattern emerged that he described as almost eerie in its consistency. Nearly all of them, across wildly different centuries and cultures and disciplines, had constructed daily lives of extraordinary routine. The creative work happened at the same time each day. The meals were regular. The walks were regular. Even the leisure was regular. Beethoven counted exactly 60 coffee beans for his morning cup. Every morning, 60 beans. The man who wrote symphonies that still make people weep 200 years later measured his coffee with the precision of a pharmacist, because that small ritual was the hinge on which his creative day swung open. You might be thinking, okay, but surely that is just personality. Surely some people are just wired for routine. And that is a fair instinct. But the psychology research pushes back on it quite firmly. A series of studies, led by the Harvard Business School researcher Francesca Gino, found that ritual behaviors, even rituals that had been arbitrarily assigned to participants just minutes before a stressful task, measurably reduced anxiety and improved performance. Not because the rituals were meaningful in any deep metaphysical sense, simply because they were structured, repeated, and predictable. The brain, facing an uncertain world, found comfort in the small, reliable loop of a known action. And that comfort was not merely subjective. It showed up in physiological measures: heart rate, cortisol levels. The body's entire stress response was quieted by the simple act of doing something the same way it had been done before. The mechanism, as best as neuroscience currently understands it, goes something like this. The brain is at its core a prediction machine. Every waking moment, it is constructing models of what is about to happen, and it is allocating energy based on those predictions. When the world matches the model, when the coffee is where you left it, when the walk takes the same time, it always does. When the evening unfolds in the familiar sequence your body has come to expect, the brain can down-regulate its vigilance systems. It doesn't need to stay on high alert. It can redirect the energy it would have spent on monitoring toward other things, toward processing, toward rest, toward the quiet integration that we talked about earlier. When the world does not match the model, when things are unpredictable, constantly novel, always demanding recalibration. The vigilance systems stay up. The cortisol stays elevated. The body stays in a mild but continuous state of readiness, which is exhausting in ways that are very difficult to perceive from the inside because it never rises to the level of a crisis. It is just a low hum, a background cost, paid every hour of every day in energy that was never really available for anything else. I think about this when I think about modern life, and I feel something that is not quite pity, but is somewhere in the neighborhood of it. We have built a world that is structurally almost perfectly designed to prevent the brain from ever finding its predicted pattern. The notifications arrive at random. The news changes by the hour. The social feeds are engineered quite deliberately by people who understand the neuroscience far better than they let on to be maximally unpredictable, because unpredictability is what keeps the eye moving, the thumb scrolling, the vigilance system just activated enough to keep you engaged. It is, if you think about it with any clarity at all, a remarkable achievement. We have created environments that make genuine rest neurologically difficult to access, and then we wonder why everyone is so tired. The antidote, fittingly, is not dramatic. It does not require a cabin in the woods, or a philosophy degree, or even a significant reorganization of your life. It requires small things done the same way with enough regularity that the brain begins to trust them. And here is the part that I find genuinely moving when I stop to think about it. The rituals that work best, the ones that create the deepest sense of safety and ease, are often the ones that engage the body as much as the mind. Warmth, specifically, temperature and touch, light and darkness. The brain's prediction of safety is not purely cognitive. It is deeply physical. It is registered in the body before it ever reaches consciousness. In Japan, the practice of a furo, the nightly hot bath taken at a consistent time each evening, has been a fixture of domestic life for centuries. It is not simply about cleanliness, though, of course it serves that purpose too. It is a ritual of thermal transition. The body cools rapidly after emerging from hot water, mimicking the temperature drop that naturally precedes sleep. In regions where a furo is practiced most consistently, researchers have noted lower rates of insomnia and self-reported anxiety than in comparable populations without the habit. The practice works, researchers now understand, partly because of the thermoregulation and partly because of something even simpler. The brain learns over months and years that the bath means safety is coming. Warmth means the day is ending. The world is contracting to a manageable known size. You can let go now. Do you have something like that? Something small and reliable that tells your body the day is done? I ask because I think it is one of the most underrated questions a person can ask themselves. Not, what are your goals? Not what are your dreams, though. Those matter too. But what are your rituals? What does your nervous system know it can count on? What are the small, reliable things that tell your brain, without words, that you are safe? The answer for many people is not much. Or I used to have something, but I got out of the habit. Or I always meant to build something like that, but I never quite got around to it. And I want to say gently, it is not too late. In fact, you are building one right now. This lying here in the dark, listening to a slow voice, tell you things that feel true. This is a ritual, and every time you return to it, the brain files it a little more firmly under the category of known, trusted, safe. The neural pathway gets a little more worn. The arrival into ease gets a little faster. Aristotle wrote in the 4th century before the Common Era that we are what we repeatedly do. He was not talking about productivity. He was not talking about success in any modern sense. He was talking about character, about the deep structure of a human life, built not from grand gestures, but from small repeated choices accumulated over years until they become the invisible architecture inside which everything else happens. Excellence, he said, is not an act. It is a habit. I would only add, so is peace. And the history of human beings who have found their way to genuine lasting equanimity, not the performed kind, not the Instagram kind, but the real kind, the kind that holds under pressure, is almost always, when you look closely, a history of small rituals honored consistently over time. The philosopher's afternoon walk, the scientist's morning circuit, the 60 coffee beans measured in the quiet before the world woke up, the warm bath that told the body reliably night after night, you made it through another day. Rest now. Rest is allowed. There is one more dimension to this that I have been saving because it is the one I find most surprising, and it connects the science of routine to something that feels much larger than any individual habit or practice. It has to do with time itself, with the way certain cultures have understood and structured time differently from the way most of the modern world does, and with what happens to the human mind when it is given not just a reliable daily rhythm, but a reliable rhythm across an entire life. That is the territory we are about to move into. And I think it might change how you see rest, not just tonight, but in every season that follows. There is a village on the island of Sardinia, perched high in the Nuoro province, where men routinely live, past 100 years old. Not just one or two men, statistically significantly more centenarian men per capita than almost anywhere else on the recorded map. Researchers have been traveling there for decades, clipboard in hand, trying to understand what these people are doing that the rest of the Western world is not. The answers they expected to find were dietary. Olive oil, perhaps. Red wine in modest quantities. Fresh vegetables from a garden. And yes, those things are present. But when researchers from the University of Sassari began conducting in-depth interviews with the oldest residents people in their late 90s and early hundreds who were still walking to the village square each afternoon, something else kept surfacing in the conversation. Something the researchers had not put on their questionnaires because it had not occurred to them to ask about it. These people had a fundamentally different relationship with time. Not philosophically, not abstractly, practically physically in the texture of every day. They did not experience time as something running out. They experienced it as something they were moving through unhurriedly, the way you might walk through a field you have walked through 1,000 times before and still find interesting. Work happened, rest happened, meals happened, conversations happened, long ones, with no particular agenda that might last 2 hours over coffee and a piece of bread. And none of it felt from the inside like it was competing with anything else. The researcher Dan Bettner, who spent years studying these populations and eventually coined the term blue zones, to describe them, noted something in his fieldwork that stuck with me when I first read it. He wrote that the people in these communities did not think of relaxation as a reward for productivity. They did not rest because they had earned it. They rested because rest was woven into the structure of the day as naturally and as non-negotiably as eating. It was not a luxury. It was not a treat. It was simply part of what a day was. This distinction sounds small. It is not small, because the psychology of how you frame rest changes everything about how the nervous system receives it. When rest is a reward, when you can only lie down after the dishes are done, after the emails are answered, after everything on the list has been crossed off, the body never fully arrives into it. Some part of the brain is always calculating whether you have done enough to deserve this, whether you should really be stopping yet, whether there is one more thing. And rest taken under those conditions is physiologically different from rest that arrives without conditions. The cortisol profile is different. The depth of recovery is different. The feeling when you wake is different. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo, who is better known perhaps for the controversial Stanford prison experiment of 1971, but whose later work I find far more interesting and far more useful, spent decades studying what he called time perspective. The idea was this: people do not all experience time the same way. Some people are predominantly future-oriented, always planning, always optimizing, always living slightly ahead of where they actually are. Some are predominantly present-oriented, living fully in the current moment, with little thought for what comes next. Some are predominantly past-oriented, living primarily in memory, in nostalgia, in the ongoing conversation between who they were and who they have become. None of these orientations is purely good or bad. Zimbardo's research, eventually published in his 2008 book, The Time Paradox, found that the healthiest and most resilient people tended to hold a balanced time perspective, able to draw on the past without being trapped by it, able to plan for the future without sacrificing the present to it, and able to be genuinely fully in the moment they were actually occupying. But here is what caught my attention. The pathology he identified most consistently in modern Western populations was not depression, not anxiety, not any of the conditions you might expect. It was a specific distortion of future orientation, a chronic inability to inhabit the present moment, because the future was always more real than what was actually happening right now. People so oriented toward what came next that they were, in a very real sense, never quite here. Sound familiar? The Okinawan people of Japan, another blue zone community and one of the most studied populations in longevity research, have a concept that does not translate precisely into English, but that researchers have spent a lot of time trying to approximate. The word is ikigai, and it is often rendered as reason for being, or purpose, which is not wrong, but is also not quite right. Because ikigai, as it is actually lived in Okinawan culture, is not a grand statement about vocation or legacy. It is something far more granular. It is the small daily particular thing that makes getting out of bed feel worthwhile. For one person, it might be tending a garden. For another, it is the morning conversation with a neighbor. For another, the specific pleasure of cooking a particular dish that their grandmother taught them. What is significant psychologically is not the content of the ikigai, It is the scale of it. It is the fact that meaning in this framework is not located somewhere in the future, not in a goal to be achieved or a milestone to be reached, but in the texture of the present day. The garden is not a means to an end. It is the end. The conversation is not filler between important things. It is one of the important things. Researchers who followed Okinawan centenarians over time found that those who could articulate a clear ikigai had significantly lower rates of cognitive decline, significantly lower rates of cardiovascular disease, and significantly longer lifespans than those who could not even after controlling for diet, exercise, and social connection. Meaning, it turned out, was not just psychologically comforting, it was physiologically protective. The body that knows why it is getting up in the morning is a different body at the cellular level from the one that does not. Now, I want to take a step back here, because I think it is worth asking how we got so far from this. How did a species that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in relatively slow, rhythmic, community-embedded ways end up in a world that runs at the speed we currently run at? The answer is surprisingly recent and in some ways surprisingly arbitrary. Before the Industrial Revolution, which, depending on which historian you follow, gathered its full force somewhere between 1750 and 1850, the primary rhythm of human life in most parts of the world was agricultural. And agricultural time is not clock time. It is seasonal. It is tidal. It has rush periods planting harvest, and it has long expanses of genuine quiet. Winter in pre-industrial Europe was not a season of productivity. It was a season of repair, of rest, of stories told by firelight, of the kind of deep social slowness that the nervous system, as we have been discussing, was built for. The historian Roger E. Kirch, in his deeply researched 2005 book, A Day's Close Night in Times Past, uncovered something remarkable buried in the historical record. Before artificial lighting became widespread, most people in the pre-industrial world did not sleep in one long block the way we are told we should. They slept in two segments, with a quiet waking period of an hour or two in the middle of the night, a time that contemporary sources described as being used for prayer, for gentle conversation, for reflection, sometimes for reading by candlelight, sometimes simply for lying in the dark and thinking. Kirch found references to this practice called first sleep and second sleep in sources ranging from medical texts to court records to poetry across multiple European languages and cultures. It was not insomnia. It was the normal baseline pattern of human sleep before the gas lamp, and then the electric bulb extended the usable day and compressed the night into a single, efficient block. What was lost in that compression, Kirch argues, was not just sleep time. It was a specific kind of time, a liminal, quiet, unstructured hour in the dark that served some function we cannot quite name, but that the body clearly misses. The hour between first sleep and second sleep was, by all the historical accounts, a genuinely peaceful one. People did not use it productively. They simply were in it. And then they slept again and woke rested in a way that the modern sleep literature spends an enormous amount of energy trying to recover. I find this piece of history oddly comforting, and I suspect I am not alone in that, because it suggests that the restlessness many people feel at night, the waking at 2 in the morning, the lying there wondering if something is wrong with them, may not be a disorder at all. It may be a very old pattern surfacing through the thin membrane of a modern schedule that was never quite built for it. The Costa Rican Nicoya Peninsula is the third Blue Zone community I want to mention, and it is perhaps the most striking in terms of what it reveals about the psychology of time. The Nicoyan centenarians, who have been studied extensively by researchers, including the epidemiologist Luis Rosero Bixby, showed something that initially puzzled the research team. Their lives were by almost any material measure harder than those of comparable populations in wealthier regions. Less access to medical care, less economic security, less of almost everything that the developed world tends to associate with longevity and well-being. And yet they lived longer, with less cognitive decline, with lower rates of stress-related disease than populations far more materially comfortable. The difference that kept emerging as researchers dug deeper was relational and temporal. These were people embedded in dense, stable social networks, the same neighbors, the same family rhythms, the same community patterns across entire lifetimes. And they experienced time not as a resource that was being depleted, but as a medium they were living inside, the way a fish lives inside water. They were not racing against it. They were not managing it. They were just in it. There is a Spanish phrase still common in Nicoya poco a poco, which means little by little, and which functions there less as a description of pace and more as a philosophy of existence. Things happen poco a poco. Relationships build poco a poco. A life, a good one, is assembled poco a poco. Not efficiently, not optimally, but fully and with enough room around each moment to actually feel it happening. I think about that phrase sometimes when I notice myself rushing through something that didn't need to be rushed. When I eat lunch while answering messages. When I walk somewhere and realize I have no memory of the walk because my mind was 3 steps ahead the whole time. Poco a poco. Little by little. The reminder that the speed is optional even when it doesn't feel optional. Especially when it doesn't feel optional. The psychologist Ellen Langer at Harvard University spent decades studying what she called mindlessness, the automatic, unconsidered way most people move through their days and its relationship to physical health. One of her most striking findings from a study conducted in 1979 and replicated in various forms since involved a group of elderly men who spent a week living as though it were 20 years earlier. The environment was set up to match that era in every detail. The music, the magazines, the conversations. The men were not asked to reminisce. They were asked to simply inhabit the past as if it were present. After 1 week, measurable physical changes had occurred. Improved grip strength, better posture, higher scores on tests of memory and cognitive function. Even their vision improved slightly. The researcher's interpretation was careful and measured, as good researchers' interpretations tend to be. But the implication was difficult to escape. The body responds to the psychological context it is placed in. A mind that believes it is inhabiting a slower, more spacious time begins in small but measurable ways to inhabit it physically as well, which brings us back to the Sardinian hillside, to the old man walking to the village square in the afternoon sun with no particular urgency and no particular destination, just the pleasurable routine of a body that knows where it is going and is in no hurry to arrive. He is not practicing wellness. He is not optimizing his longevity. He almost certainly has never heard of cortisol or the default mode network or time perspective theory. He is just living inside his life at the speed his life actually moves, in the place where his roots go down. And his nervous system, without any instruction from anyone, knows exactly what to do with that. There is something in this that reaches beyond psychology, beyond neuroscience, beyond any framework I can offer with confidence. It touches something more personal, something about the quality of a human life that cannot be measured in biomarkers or productivity metrics or even in years. It is the question of whether at the end of things you felt like you were actually there, whether you inhabited your own days or whether you were always somewhere else mentally preparing for a later that kept moving forward, just out of reach. The science of slowness points in one direction, and so does almost every wisdom tradition that humanity has managed to preserve. But what actually shifts something inside us, what makes the mind genuinely lastingly softer, is rarely a concept. It is usually something more immediate, something felt, not just understood. And the most immediate felt experience of safety that the human nervous system knows, one that predates language, predates philosophy, predates everything except the body itself, is the one we have somehow managed to overlook for the longest time. It lives not in the mind, not in the daily schedule, not even in the village square, at a gentle afternoon pace. It lives in the body, in the literal physical cellular language of touch, warmth, and being held. And what science has discovered there in the last few decades is something that will make you reconsider almost every moment of human connection you have ever experienced. When was the last time someone held your hand? Not a handshake, not a polite greeting at a party, an actual unhurried, deliberate holding, where someone took your hand and stayed there, and you felt somewhere beneath the level of thought, something inside you settle. If you have to think about it for more than a few seconds, you are in good company. And also, the science has something important to say to you. We tend to think of touch as one of the simpler senses. Sight is grand, complex, philosophical, the subject of entire libraries of theory and poetry. Hearing carries music, language, the voice of someone you love. But touch seems almost too basic for serious contemplation. It is just nerve endings and skin, isn't it? Just the surface of things. Except that it isn't. And the story of how scientists came to understand that the slow, sometimes heartbreaking, ultimately astonishing story of what human touch actually does inside the body is one of the more quietly revolutionary chapters in the history of psychology. Let me begin, not with a laboratory, but with a hospital. Several hospitals actually scattered across the United States and Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. They were, by the standards of the time, modern and well-run, clean, adequately staffed, committed to preventing infection, which was then still a leading cause of infant mortality. And in that commitment to cleanliness and infection control, they had adopted a practice that seemed, from a purely medical standpoint, entirely rational. Babies in the nursery wards were handled as little as possible. Fed on schedule, changed on schedule, kept warm but not held, not carried, not cuddled, not rocked. Physical contact beyond the necessary minimum was considered a vector for disease and possibly also for a kind of spoiling that the child psychology of the era actively warned against. The babies were in every measurable clinical sense being cared for, and they were dying, not from infection, not from malnutrition. The death rates in these well-run, carefully managed hospital nurseries were in some institutions above 30% in the first year of life. In others, the numbers were worse. Children who had no diagnosable illness simply faded. They stopped gaining weight. They became listless, unresponsive, glassy-eyed. They developed what physicians at the time called marasmus, a word derived from the Greek for wasting, and then in many cases, they died of it. Nobody could explain it. The medical establishment fumbled for answers in the usual places: nutritional deficiencies, undetected pathogens, genetic vulnerabilities. What they were not looking for, because it did not fit the model of the body they were working with, was the possibility that something the babies needed was not in any pharmacopoeia, that they were dying in the most literal sense for want of being held. The psychiatrist who eventually looked directly at this question was a Viennese-born researcher named René Spitz. In the 1940s, Spitz conducted a study comparing two groups of infants raised in institutional settings. The first group was in a prison nursery, not an obviously promising environment where the mothers who were inmates were permitted to handle and interact with their babies freely for extended periods each day. The second group was in a foundling home, clean and well-staffed, where the infants received professional care but minimal personal attention. Each nurse was responsible for 7 to 8 babies, which meant that each baby received perhaps a few minutes of genuine human contact per day. Over the course of the study, the prison nursery children thrived. They developed normally. They gained weight, reached developmental milestones, showed curiosity and responsiveness. The foundling home children, despite their materially superior environment, deteriorated in ways that Spitz filmed and documented with a methodical precision that makes the footage, even now, genuinely difficult to watch. By the end of the study period, more than a third of the foundling home children had died. Those who survived showed profound developmental delays. Some never fully recovered. Spitz named what he was observing anaclitic depression, a depression born of the withdrawal of something the infant requires as fundamentally as food and air. He argued in papers published in 1945 and 1946 that human infants do not merely benefit from physical contact and emotional attunement. They require it. The absence of it is not a deprivation. It is at sufficient severity and duration a physiological catastrophe. The medical establishment of the time received this work with something between discomfort and outright resistance. Because if Spitz was right, then the sterile, efficiently managed hospital nurseries that modern medicine was so proud of were in a very specific sense doing harm. And that was not a comfortable conclusion. It took a psychologist working with rhesus monkeys to finally break the resistance open, Harry Harlow at the University of Wisconsin. And yes, the same University of Wisconsin where Richard Davidson would later conduct his own foundational work, which I find a satisfying coincidence, spent the 1950s designing a series of experiments that he knew from the beginning were going to be controversial. He separated infant monkeys from their mothers at birth and gave them 2 surrogate mothers, one made of wire mesh fitted with a bottle of milk, and one made of soft terry cloth with no food attached. The dominant theory of the time, the behaviorist model that had governed developmental psychology for decades, predicted that the infant monkeys would attach to the wire mother. She had the food. Attachment in the behaviorist framework was a conditioned response to reward, and food was the primary reward. The prediction was logical, clean, and completely wrong. The infant monkeys spent the vast majority of their time clinging to the cloth mother. When frightened, they ran to her, not to the wire one. When placed in an unfamiliar environment, the ones who had access to the cloth mother explored more boldly and recovered more quickly from distress than those who did not. The cloth mother offered no nutritional value whatsoever. She offered only the sensation of soft contact of something that yielded slightly when pressed against, and that it turned out was worth more than milk. Harlow called what he was studying contact comfort, and his 1958 paper presenting these findings, delivered famously as a presidential address to the American Psychological Association, upended behavioral psychology in ways that are still being absorbed. What he had demonstrated was simple and devastating. The need for physical comfort is not a secondary drive, not a learned preference, not a habit formed through reward association. It is primary. It is foundational. It may in fact be the foundation on which everything else is built. Now, the biochemistry behind all of this, the actual molecular language the body uses to register touch and translate it into safety, took several more decades to map. The hormone oxytocin, first synthesized in the laboratory by Vincent Duvigneau in 1953, was initially understood primarily in the context of childbirth and lactation. It triggers uterine contractions. It stimulates milk production. These are its famous functions. But researchers slowly, and then with accelerating excitement, began to discover that oxytocin was doing something far more expansive than obstetrics. It was released during positive social touch of almost any kind. A hug sustained for more than 20 seconds produced a measurable spike. A gentle hand on the shoulder offered at the right moment produced a smaller but still detectable response. Stroking a pet produced it. Being stroked produced it. Even in some studies, simply being in close proximity to someone you trust without any physical contact at all nudged the levels upward in ways that the researchers found genuinely surprising. And what oxytocin does when it is present in sufficient quantity is essentially the opposite of cortisol. It reduces blood pressure. It lowers heart rate. It downregulates the activity of the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, making the world feel quite literally, at the neurochemical level, less dangerous. It promotes trust. It increases generosity. It buffers pain. In animal studies, oxytocin has been shown to accelerate wound healing. In human studies, higher baseline oxytocin levels are associated with greater social resilience and lower rates of anxiety-related disorders. The researcher Tiffany Field, who founded the Touch Research Institute at the University of Miami School of Medicine in 1992, the first research institute in the world dedicated exclusively to the scientific study of touch, spent years documenting outcomes across dozens of studies. Premature infants who received regular gentle massage gained weight 47% faster than those who did not, and were discharged from hospital an average of 6 days earlier. Elderly residents in care facilities who received regular touch from staff showed improved immune function and reported significantly lower levels of loneliness. Adults with chronic anxiety who received consistent appropriate physical reassurance showed measurable changes in their resting physiological state within weeks. What Field was demonstrating across population after population was not a soft feel-good phenomenon. It was a hard clinical one. Touch is medicine. Contact comfort is not a luxury category of human experience. It belongs in the same tier of fundamental need as nutrition and sleep. Here is a question I find myself returning to, and I'll put it to you directly. How did we forget this? Because we did forget it, at least in significant portions of Western culture. The child psychology manuals of the early 20th century actively discouraged physical affection between parents and children, warning that too much holding would produce weakness of character. The behaviorist John Watson, whose influence on American parenting advice peaked in the 1920s and 30s, wrote with the confident authority of the hopelessly wrong that parents should never hug or kiss their children, never let them sit on a lap, and should greet them only with a handshake in the morning. He believed he was advocating for a generation of strong, independent, emotionally self-sufficient adults. What he was actually doing, we now know, was prescribing a program of contact deprivation that caused measurable developmental harm to an unknowable number of children. And the echoes of that philosophy did not vanish when behaviorism fell from favor. They lingered in the culture. They became embedded in a particular strain of Anglo-American stoicism. The stiff upper lip, the don't be soft, the children should not be coddled tradition that still surfaces in unexpected places, in unexpected generations, in the vague discomfort many adults feel about receiving physical affection as if being soothed was somehow embarrassing. The anthropologist Helen Fisher has pointed out that touch norms vary enormously across cultures, and that the variation maps in interesting ways onto population-level mental health outcomes. In a study observing pairs of friends sitting together in coffee shops in various cities around the world, researchers counted the number of times they touched each other during a 1-hour conversation. In San Juan, Puerto Rico, the average was 180 times. In Paris, it was 110. In London, 0. In Gainesville, Florida, 2. 2. Now that is a single observational study, not a referendum on any culture's emotional depth. And touch norms are shaped by a genuinely complex web of historical, religious, and social factors that deserve more nuance than a single data point can carry. But it does point towards something worth examining: whether the cultures that are most uncomfortable with touch are also the cultures producing the most prolific literature about loneliness and disconnection, which, when you look at the numbers on both, is a question that more or less answers itself. The good news, and I want to make sure we end this particular stretch of the conversation with the good news because it is genuinely good, is that the body's capacity to respond to touch does not diminish with neglect. It waits. It remains available. People who were touch-deprived in childhood and who encounter safe, appropriate physical affection later in life show oxytocin responses that are in many studies indistinguishable from those who were touched freely from infancy. The longing does not erase the capacity. The system is patient in the way that the deepest biological systems tend to be patient. It keeps the door open, which means that no matter how long it has been, no matter how far you have drifted from the easy physical warmth of early life, or how thoroughly your culture trained you to hold yourself at arm's length from other people's comfort, the pathway back exists. It is in the nervous system waiting. It has been there the whole time. And interestingly, for all the power that physical touch carries, it is not the only language the body uses to process safety and connection. There is an entire dimension of human experience, one that psychology spent a long time treating as purely cognitive, that actually runs much deeper than thought. It lives in the muscles, in the breath, in the particular quality of a body that has been carrying something for a very long time without realizing it. What the body holds and how it holds it and what it takes to set it down, that is a story unto itself. And it begins in places you might not expect. Picture a woman sitting in a therapist's office sometime in the 1970s. She has been in therapy for years. She is articulate, self-aware, genuinely committed to understanding her own inner life. She can describe in precise and sophisticated language exactly what happened to her. She knows the timeline. She knows the people involved. She knows intellectually that it was not her fault, that she has survived, that she is safe now. And yet every morning she wakes with her jaw clenched so tightly that her teeth ache. Her shoulders live somewhere around her ears. When someone moves toward her unexpectedly, her body flinches before her mind has registered any threat. She cannot explain it. The knowledge is all there. The understanding is all there. But the body seems to be running on a different operating system entirely, one that did not get the memo that the danger has passed. Her therapist, trained in the talking tradition that had dominated Western psychology for nearly a century, listened carefully and continued to ask the right questions. And something about the body's stubborn refusal to follow the mind's conclusions was beginning to trouble a young researcher named Peter Levine, who was working in those same years on a question that nobody had quite articulated. Yet why do some people recover from overwhelming experiences and others do not? And what does the body have to do with it? The answer Levine found slowly and through a route that took him through biology, ethology, and the observation of wild animals was not what the field expected, and it changed the way a quiet but growing number of therapists understood what healing actually requires. But to understand where Levine arrived, it helps to understand where Western medicine started, which is a place very far from the body. In 1641, a French philosopher sitting alone by a stove in a small room in the Netherlands wrote a sentence that would shape the next 4 centuries of Western thought about the human mind. René Descartes wrote, "I think, therefore I am." And from that starting point, he built a philosophical architecture that placed the mind, rational, conscious, verbal, at the center of the human experience and positioned the body as something else, a mechanism, a vessel, a sophisticated piece of biological machinery that the mind inhabited but was fundamentally separate from. The mind-body split that Descartes formalized was not entirely his invention. Versions of it run through Greek philosophy, through Platonic thought, through strands of early Christian theology that associated the flesh with weakness and the spirit with truth. But Descartes gave it a rigorous philosophical framework at exactly the moment when Western medicine was beginning to take its modern shape. And so the split got built into the foundations. For 400 years, Western medicine treated the body as a system of parts, organs, bones, nerves, chemicals, each with a specific function, each subject to specific interventions when something went wrong. And it treated the mind as something categorically different. Thoughts, feelings, memories, the territory of psychology and psychiatry. The idea that these two domains were not actually separate, that the body does not just house the mind, but is continuously shaped by it and shapes it in return, was not mainstream medicine. It was fringe. It was alternative. It was, to many respectable practitioners, somewhat embarrassing. What is remarkable in retrospect is how long this division held, because the evidence against it had been accumulating for decades. Wilhelm Reich was a student of Sigmund Freud in Vienna in the 1920s, and even within that already unconventional setting, he was considered difficult. His central argument that emotional experience was not stored only in the mind, but also in the body, specifically in patterns of chronic muscular tension that he called character armor, was dismissed by his contemporaries as eccentric at best. Reich believed that the body developed a kind of physical holding pattern in response to overwhelming emotion, the shoulders that never quite dropped the chest, that never quite expanded fully, the jaw set at a permanent angle of guardedness. These were not metaphors. He believed they were literal, measurable, physiological adaptations to psychological experience. Reich's life ended badly, and his later work veered into territory that made it easy for the establishment to dismiss everything that came before. But the core clinical observation that the body holds what the mind cannot process turned out to be more durable than his reputation. Decades later, working independently and without Reich's influence, researchers were arriving at the same place from entirely different directions. Peter Levine's particular route began with a question about deer. He had noticed, as anyone who spends time observing wildlife eventually notices, that prey animals, deer, rabbits, gazelles, are subjected to life-threatening stress on a fairly regular basis. A gazelle chased by a cheetah experiences physiologically an activation of the nervous system that is virtually identical to what a human being experiences during extreme fear. The heart rate spikes, the muscles flood with blood. Every system orients toward one thing: survival. And then, if the gazelle escapes, something happens that Levine found fascinating. The animal stops. It trembles, often violently, a full body shaking that can last for several minutes. And then, almost as abruptly as it began, the trembling stops. The gazelle shakes its head, looks around, and within a short time is grazing again, as though nothing happened. The stress cycle has completed. The nervous system has discharged what it mobilized and returned to baseline. What Levine observed in his human clients was something quite different. The same enormous mobilization of the nervous system occurred in response to overwhelming experience. But the discharge, the shaking, the trembling, the physical completion of the cycle was almost always interrupted by social pressure, by the injunction to hold yourself together to not make a scene, to be strong, to push through it. By the very understandable human desire to not be seen, falling apart. And so, the mobilized energy, with nowhere to go, stayed in the body. Not as memory in the narrative sense, not as a story the person could tell, but as a residue of activation that the nervous system had never been permitted to complete. The woman with the clenched jaw, the shoulders near the ears, the flinch before the thought. Levine called his approach somatic experiencing, and the word somatic comes from the Greek soma, meaning body. The methodology he developed was not about reliving difficult experiences in narrative form. It was about guiding the body very gently back toward the discharge it had been prevented from completing. Small movements, micro trembles, the breath that finally, after years, goes all the way down to the belly. He published his first major work, Waking the Tiger, in 1997, and it opened a conversation that had been waiting a long time to begin. But perhaps no one opened it more widely or more unexpectedly than a psychiatrist named Bessel van der Kolk, whose 2014 book, The Body Keeps the Score, became, against all reasonable publishing expectations, one of the best-selling books about psychology of the past 30 years. The title says everything about its central argument, that the body is not a passive recipient of psychological experience, but an active participant in it, that what happens to us is registered not only in the mind, but in the flesh, in the posture, in the breath, in the particular way a person holds themselves against the possibility of more. Van der Kolk spent decades at Boston University and Harvard Medical School studying populations who had experienced overwhelming events and the physiological aftermath that followed. What he found consistently was that the therapeutic approaches most effective at producing genuine recovery were not primarily the verbal ones. Talk therapy, he argued, is extraordinarily valuable for many things, but for the specific task of helping the body release what it has been holding, for helping the nervous system complete what it was never allowed to complete, you often need something that bypasses language altogether. Movement, breath, rhythm, the arts, the body in relationship with other bodies. These were not supplements to the real work in van der Kolk's view. In many cases, they were the real work, and this is where I want to turn east, because the traditions that van der Kolk and Levine were rediscovering through clinical research had never been lost in other parts of the world. They had simply been disregarded by Western medicine as insufficiently scientific, which is a polite way of saying they had been dismissed because they belonged to cultures whose knowledge systems were not considered authoritative. The Lakota Sioux people of the northern Great Plains had for generations practiced what anthropologists who approached with genuine curiosity described as sophisticated communal healing ceremonies, the Inapi or sweat lodge ceremony being one of the most well-documented. The ceremony involved heat, breath, darkness, communal prayer song, and the physical presence of others. It was not primarily cognitive. It was not verbal in the way that Western therapy is verbal. It engaged the body specifically. It engaged the nervous system through sensory experience rhythm and the profound physiological effect of heat on the autonomic nervous system. Researchers who have studied the Inipi ceremony in recent decades including psychologists at the University of New Mexico working with Lakota communities, have found measurable reductions in physiological stress markers in participants following the ceremony, reductions comparable to those produced by clinical interventions for anxiety. The Lakota healers did not need a study to tell them this. They had been observing it for centuries. The Maori of New Zealand have a practice called mirimiri, a form of therapeutic bodywork that combines physical manipulation with karakia, or prayer, and with the presence of whanau, the extended family network. Mirimiri is not massage in the Western sense, though it involves some of the same physical techniques. It is understood within its own framework as a restoration of balance between the body and the wider web of relationships, ancestral, communal, spiritual, within which the body exists. The body in this understanding is never a standalone system. It is always embedded, always in conversation with something larger than itself. What strikes me about these traditions, and I want to be careful here to speak as an observer and not as someone claiming a cultural authority I don't have, is how much they share at the level of mechanism with what Western clinical research eventually arrived at on its own: the engagement of the body, the importance of rhythm and breath, the presence of community, the understanding that healing is not something that happens inside an individual mind, but something that happens between bodies and between a body and its environment. The Cartesian split took 400 years to build into the foundations of Western medicine. It is taking somewhat longer to take apart, but it is coming apart, piece by piece, study by study, clinical observation by clinical observation. And in the space that is opening up, something old is coming back, not as a rejection of science, but as a deepening of it, a recognition that the body was always part of the story, that it was always speaking, that it was never, despite what the textbook said, merely a vessel. Something I find worth sitting with, and I offer this not as instruction, but simply as an observation from someone who has spent time with this material, is the possibility that the body's wisdom is not always dramatic, not always a visible trembling or a notable release. Sometimes it is the quality of a single breath taken without effort, the shoulders that drop half an inch without you deciding to drop them, the jaw that unclenches at some point in the evening when the day has finally truly become the past. These small things are the body reporting in, saying, "I got the message. I know we're safe now." And when the body finally says that, when it trusts enough to say that, something else becomes available. Something that sits at the intersection of time loss and the strange human gift of acceptance. Because the body's release is only possible when the mind has done something that, for many people, is the hardest work of all: letting go of the idea that things should have been different from how they were. That is not a passive act. It is not resignation. And the psychology of how it actually happens, the real mechanics of acceptance, not the greeting card version, is a story that begins in 12th century Japan and has never quite been finished. In a small museum in Kyoto, there is a tea bowl that most visitors walk past without stopping. It is not beautiful, not in any conventional sense. It is lopsided. The glaze has dripped unevenly down one side and pooled at the base in a way that no skilled potter would consider intentional. The clay shows the marks of the hands that shaped it. There are small imperfections in the rim, Not chips exactly, but irregularities, the kind that make you think the person who made it was working quickly, or was distracted, or simply did not care very much about symmetry. And yet this bowl, and objects like it, were considered by the most cultivated aesthetic minds of 16th century Japan to be among the most precious things in existence. Tea masters would travel days to drink from them. Feudal lords would trade territories for them. A single such bowl could be worth in the currency of that culture's deepest values more than a palace. The philosophy behind that valuation has a name, wabi-sabi, and it is at its heart a psychology of impermanence, a way of seeing the world that finds its deepest beauty, not despite the fact that things change, fade, and eventually disappear, but precisely because of it. Wabi, in its original meaning, carried connotations of loneliness, of simplicity, of the particular quietness of an empty room. Sabi referred to the beauty of age, the patina on old metal, the moss on a stone, the way a wooden floor darkens over decades of footsteps. Together, the two words described something that Japanese aesthetics had been reaching toward for centuries, but that crystallized most fully in the 16th century in the hands and mind of a tea master named Sen no Rikyu. Rikyu was by any measure one of the most influential aesthetic figures in Japanese history. He served as tea master to the two most powerful men of his era, the warlord Oda Nobunaga and later Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who effectively unified Japan under his rule in the 1580s. Tea ceremony in this period was not a quiet domestic ritual. It was a political instrument, a theater of power, a context in which alliances were made and unmade. The tea room was where Japan's most powerful men showed the world and each other what they valued, and what Rikyu showed them they should value was astonishing in its simplicity. Under his influence, the elaborate imported Chinese ceramics that had previously been the status objects of the tea world were gradually displaced by rough, irregular, hand-formed Japanese bowls. The tea rooms he designed were tiny, barely large enough for a few people to sit with low doorways that required every guest, regardless of rank, to bow to enter. The flowers in the alcove were wild ones, casually arranged. The kettle was old. The aesthetic was one of deliberate incompleteness of materials that showed their age and their making of beauty that arrived not through perfection, but through the willingness to be honestly openly what something was. Rikyu called this aesthetic sensibility wabi, and he spent his career teaching it to people who had spent their lives equating value with magnificence. His influence was so profound that it reshaped Japanese aesthetics for the next 4 centuries and produced, among other things, the art of kintsugi, the practice of repairing broken ceramics with gold lacquer so that the crack becomes the most visible, most celebrated part of the object. The breakage is not hidden, it is honored. The history of damage becomes the history of survival rendered in gold. I find kintsugi almost unbearably moving when I think about it clearly, because it represents a philosophy that most of us spend our entire lives working against, the idea that what has been broken is not diminished by its breaking, that the repair is not a concealment of damage, but a transformation of it, that an object, a life, does not become less beautiful because it has been through something hard. It becomes, if anything more, itself. But here is where I want to turn to the psychology, because the emotional logic of wabi-sabi turns out to have a precise and rather fascinating counterpart in Western research, one that arrives at the same destination from an entirely different direction. In the 1970s, a pair of researchers named Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell published a paper on what they called the hedonic treadmill, the tendency of human beings to return over time to a relatively stable baseline of well-being, regardless of what happens to them. The gains and the losses, the promotions and the setbacks, the windfalls and the heartbreaks, all of them shift the emotional dial, but none of them shift it permanently. The dial keeps returning. Brickman and Campbell illustrated this with a study that has become one of the most cited in all of positive psychology. They compared three groups: people who had recently won major lottery prizes, people who had recently experienced severe accidents that left them with significant physical limitations, and a control group of ordinary people who had experienced neither. The assumption that almost everyone holds intuitively was that the lottery winners would be dramatically happier than the control group, and the accident survivors would be dramatically less happy. What they found was more complicated and considerably more interesting. Within roughly a year of their life-changing events, both the lottery winners and the accident survivors had returned in terms of self-reported well-being to approximately where they had been before. The lottery winners were not significantly happier than the control group in their daily moment-to-moment experience. The accident survivors were not as unhappy as the control group imagined they themselves would be in similar circumstances. The psychologist Daniel Gilbert at Harvard University built an entire research program around this phenomenon, which he called affective forecasting, the human tendency to predict our future emotional states and the systematic ways in which those predictions are wrong. We consistently overestimate how bad the bad things will feel and how long the good things will feel good. The mind, Gilbert found, has what he called a psychological immune system, a set of largely unconscious processes by which it makes meaning, finds silver linings, reframes circumstances, and reconstructs narratives in ways that protect our sense of well-being. It does this without being asked. It does it automatically, and it does it far more effectively than most of us believe we are capable of. What Gilbert's research suggests, and what I find genuinely comforting on the nights when things feel heavy, is that the human mind is not a passive recorder of experience. It is an active editor of it. The version of events that lives in us 6 months after something happened is not the raw footage. It is a cut, a shaped, interpreted, meaning-making construction that the mind has been quietly working on the whole time, turning raw experience into something livable. This is not the same as denial. It is not the same as pretending things didn't happen or don't hurt. It is something more sophisticated, the mind's genuine capacity to find a foothold in almost any terrain if given enough time and enough quiet. Which brings me to a man sitting alone in a tent on the border of what is now Austria, sometime in the 2nd century of the Common Era, writing in a language Greek that was not his native tongue, in a private journal that he clearly never intended anyone else to read. His name was Marcus Aurelius. He was at the time the Emperor of Rome, which is to say, the most powerful man in the known Western world. He commanded legions. He governed vast territories. He was responsible for the lives and deaths of millions of people. And in the private pages of what we now call meditations, he wrote repeatedly and with a kind of insistent gentleness directed entirely at himself about the impermanence of all things. He wrote, "Loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight." He wrote, "Confine yourself to the present." He wrote with what I imagine was the quiet weariness of a man who had seen too many certainties collapse. "How soon will you be ashes or bare bones, and your name or memory little account?" These are not the words of a man in despair. They are the words of a man who had found through Stoic philosophy and through the particular education that living a very large life provides a genuine peace with the fact that nothing lasts. Not the good things, not the bad things, not the empire, not the grief, not the afternoon light coming through the tent opening, not even the thought he was having at that moment. Nothing. And in that impermanence, rather than a source of anguish, he had found something that functioned very much like relief. The Stoics had a practice for this called memento mori, the deliberate contemplation of mortality and transience, not as a morbid exercise, but as a recalibration. The Roman general who returned from conquest rode through the streets of the city in triumph, and beside him, in the chariot, stood a slave whose only job was to whisper at intervals, "Remember, you are mortal. Remember, this passes." The function of that whisper was not to diminish the triumph. It was to protect the general from the specific psychological distortion that follows triumph, the belief that the peak is permanent, that this is how things will always be, that you have arrived somewhere that will stay arrived. The Buddhists arrived at nearly the same place through a different route. The Pali word, anicca, impermanence, is one of the three marks of existence in Buddhist teaching, and it has been at the center of contemplative practice for 2,500 years. Not because impermanence is easy to accept, but because the failure to accept it, the clinging to what is already changing, the grasping at what is already going, is the source of a particular kind of suffering that no external circumstance can relieve, because it has nothing to do with external circumstance. It is a posture of the mind, and like any posture, it can be changed. What wabi-sabi adds to this conversation, and what I think is its most distinctive contribution, is the aesthetic dimension. It is not just that impermanence is to be accepted, it is that impermanence is to be found beautiful. The crack in the bowl, repaired in gold, the moss on the stone. The way a garden in autumn is more beautiful, not less than it was in summer, because now you can see the structure of things, the bones of the trees, the shapes that were hidden under all that green abundance. A researcher named Brock Bastian at the University of Melbourne has studied what he calls the meaning of negative experience, and his findings echo the wabi-sabi aesthetic with a precision that would have delighted Sen no Rikyu. Bastian found that experiences which involve difficulty, discomfort, or loss consistently produce more lasting meaning than experiences that are purely pleasant. Not immediately, they are simply hard. But across time, the experiences that required something of us are the ones that contribute most to our sense of who we are and what our lives are about. The perfectly pleasant afternoon leaves no particular trace. The difficult winter survived becomes part of the architecture of the self. This is not an argument for seeking out difficulty. It is something more subtle, an invitation to stop treating the difficult parts of life as interruptions to the real story. They are the real story. They are often the most real parts of it. And the mind that can hold that, not with forced positivity, not with the performance of being fine, but with the genuine quiet recognition that nothing is wasted, not even the hard things, is a mind that is measurably physiologically calmer than the one that cannot. There is something particular that happens when a person genuinely makes peace with the fact that things end. Not intellectually, everyone knows things end. But in the body, in the nervous system, in the quality of attention they bring to ordinary moments. The cup of tea matters more when you know it will be gone. The conversation is richer when you are not already somewhere else in your head. The evening this evening, with its particular quality of light and sound and the slow unspooling of a story you chose to come to, this matters more, not less, because it is temporary. Which is, I think, what that lopsided tea bowl in Kyoto has been trying to say all along. Not nothing matters, because nothing lasts, but rather everything matters more, because nothing lasts. Look carefully. Be here. The impermanence is not the problem. The impermanence is the gift. And yet, even knowing all of this, even feeling the truth of it in the body the way you sometimes do when something lands just right, there is another dimension of human experience that the individual mind cannot navigate alone. There is something that the Stoic philosopher cannot find in his private journal. Something that the tea master, for all his wisdom, could not brew into a bowl. It is the particular relief of looking up from your own interior life and realizing that the person across from you is carrying something remarkably similar. That you are not, in your struggle, as singular as you thought. That the loneliness of being a specific person in a specific life at a specific moment, that loneliness, it turns out, has company. Extraordinary, unexpected, consoling company. And the science of that discovery is stranger and more beautiful than almost anything we have covered so far. There is a particular moment that most people have experienced, but almost nobody talks about. You are sitting with someone, a friend, a sister, a person you have known for years, but perhaps not deeply, and somehow in the course of an ordinary conversation, one of you says something honest. Not dramatically honest, just genuinely, unguardedly true. Maybe it is an admission of fear. Maybe it is the quiet confession that something you have been presenting as fine is not actually fine. And the other person goes still for a moment. And then they say, "Me too. I thought it was just me." And something happens in that exchange that is almost physical in its relief, a loosening, a warmth that arrives without warning. The particular comfort of realizing that the thing you have been carrying alone, the thing you assumed was a private defect, a personal failure of some kind, evidence of your specific inadequacy, is in fact shared. That you are not the only one. That the loneliness of your particular experience has, without your knowing it, been company all along. Psychologists have a name for the underlying phenomenon that makes that moment possible. They call it common humanity. And the researcher who has done the most systematic work on it, a psychologist named Kristin Neff at the University of Texas at Austin, came to it not through academic interest alone, but through her own experience of sitting on a meditation cushion in the late 1990s, listening to a Buddhist teacher talk about suffering and recognizing something she had not expected to find in a philosophy classroom. She recognized herself. Neff had been working at the time on what she later described as a fairly ordinary collection of human difficulties, a marriage that was ending, a career that felt uncertain, a persistent low-level sense that she was not quite managing things as well as the people around her appeared to be. None of it was catastrophic, but it was the kind of quiet, grinding accumulation of difficulty that tends to feel from the inside uniquely personal, as though everyone else had received an instruction manual for being a person that you somehow missed. What the Buddhist teaching offered her, and what she spent the next 2 decades translating into rigorous psychological research, was a reframe so simple it sounds almost trivial until you actually try to apply it. The idea that suffering is not exceptional. That struggle is not a sign of individual failure. That the difficulty of being a human being, with a body that gets sick and tired, with a mind that loops and doubts, with relationships that require more than any of us always have to give, is the shared condition of everyone who has ever lived, not the personal failing of anyone in particular. She called the quality of recognizing this common humanity, and she identified it as one of 3 core components of self-compassion alongside mindfulness and self-kindness. And what her research found consistently and across many studies was that common humanity was not merely a philosophical comfort, it was a measurable psychological one. People who scored high on her common humanity scale showed lower rates of anxiety, depression, and rumination. They recovered more quickly from setbacks. They were more motivated to try difficult things again after failing. And perhaps most counterintuitively, they were more empathetic toward others, not less than people with lower scores. This last finding surprised some people. There is a persistent cultural assumption that focusing on your own suffering is somehow self-indulgent, that the properly generous thing to do is to minimize your own pain and attend to others. But Neff's data suggested the opposite dynamic. The person who can acknowledge their own difficulty with some gentleness, who can hold their own imperfection without either denying it or drowning in it, turns out to be significantly better at holding space for other people's imperfection as well. Compassion is not a finite resource that gets depleted by turning it inward. It appears, in fact, to be a capacity that grows with use in any direction. But I want to step back from the laboratory for a moment because the science of shared humanity has a history that runs much longer and much deeper than any research university. Cast your mind to England in the early 18th century, 1700s, 1710s, 1720s. The country was in the middle of a social transformation that had no real precedent. The early stages of industrialization, the migration of rural populations into cities, the dismantling of the village structures that had for centuries provided the informal social safety net of community life. People who had grown up knowing everyone within a 5-mile radius now found themselves in cities of tens of thousands, surrounded by strangers without the kinship networks and communal institutions that had always been there. What emerged in response spontaneously from the ground up without any central organization or government mandate, was a remarkable proliferation of what were called friendly societies. These were voluntary associations of working-class people, mostly men, in the beginning, though increasingly women, as the century progressed, who gathered regularly paid small dues into a common fund and agreed to support each other in times of need. If a member fell ill and could not work, the society paid his expenses. If a member died, the society paid for the burial and provided for the widow and children. In return, the member attended meetings, participated in the communal life of the group, and upheld the social obligations that membership entailed. By 1815, there were an estimated 9,000 friendly societies operating across England with a combined membership of roughly 900,000 people. By the middle of the 19th century, more working-class Britons belonged to a friendly society than to a trade union or a church congregation. They were in scope and reach one of the largest voluntary social movements in British history, and they receive, in proportion to their significance, almost no attention in the standard historical narrative. What is striking about them when you read the records is not the financial function, remarkable as that was in an era without any state welfare provision. It is the social one. The meetings were not purely administrative. They involved rituals, ceremonies, shared meals, elaborate hierarchies of membership with titles and regalia that now seem almost theatrical, but served in context a very precise psychological function. They created a sense of belonging to something that had weight and continuity and meaning. They created in the anonymous chaos of the industrial city a community of people who knew your name and who would, if things went badly, show up. The same impulse generated parallel institutions across the Atlantic. In the United States, fraternal organizations, the Odd Fellows, founded in Baltimore in 1819, the Ancient Order of United Workmen, founded in 1868, dozens of others performed similar functions for immigrant populations navigating a new and often bewildering country. For African American communities in the post-Civil War, South mutual aid societies were not merely socially valuable, but functionally essential, providing insurance, education, funding, and community infrastructure in a society that offered them almost none. What all of these organizations understood, without benefit of psychological terminology, was something that research has since confirmed: the knowledge that you are not alone, that there are people who have committed formally and publicly to give a damn about what happens to you, changes something in the nervous system that no amount of private resolve can change on its own. Stanley Schachter at Columbia University got at this in a beautifully designed experiment published in 1959. He told participants they were about to receive electric shocks. Some were told the shocks would be intense, others that they would be mild, and then gave them a choice: wait alone or wait with other people who were also about to receive the same shocks. The participants who had been told to expect intense shocks overwhelmingly chose to wait with others. Those expecting mild shocks showed no strong preference either way. Schachter's interpretation was that shared anxiety has a specific social utility. It provides information comparison and the particular comfort of knowing that what you are feeling is proportionate and real. The phrase he used to describe the finding misery, "love's company," sounds like a cynical observation. But the research behind it is genuinely tender. What it reveals is not that humans are drawn together by a shared appetite for suffering. It is that suffering, when witnessed by another person who is themselves vulnerable, becomes less isolating, less overwhelming, more metabolizable. The presence of another person in the same storm does not make the storm smaller, but it makes you feel correctly that you are less likely to be destroyed by it. There is a thread in the Catholic contemplative tradition that I find relevant here, not theologically, but psychologically. The confessional as a practice dates in its formal structure to the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, though versions of it existed in the Church long before. The theology behind it is specific to Catholic teaching, and not what I am interested in here. What interests me is the psychological structure of the act itself, the speaking aloud, in private, to another person of the things that weigh most heavily. The naming of what has been held in silence. The psychologist James Pennebaker at the University of Texas spent decades studying what happens when people write or speak about difficult experiences, and his findings are among the most robust in social psychology. People who spent 15 to 20 minutes writing about their most stressful experiences, not analyzing them, not resolving them, just expressing them, showed measurable improvements in physical health outcomes in the months that followed. Fewer visits to the doctor, improved immune function, lower blood pressure. The effect was not explained by any cognitive shift in how they understood the experience. It appeared to be explained simply by the act of externalizing it, of moving it from inside the silence of the self to somewhere outside the page, the air, the presence of another. Pennebaker called it expressive writing. Spiritual directors had called it confession. Therapists call it disclosure. The Friendly Society members gathered around a table with their dues paid and their sorrows known might simply have called it Tuesday evening. The form varies. The mechanism across all of these forms appears to be essentially the same. The experience of being a full, complicated, struggling human being in the presence of other full, complicated, struggling human beings. The experience of not having to perform a more composed version of yourself. The relief, and it is the right word, relief, with all its physical connotations of weight being lifted, of not having to hold it all alone. Here is a question worth sitting with tonight, if you are open to it. Is there something you have been carrying that you have not yet told anyone? Not because it is unspeakable, but because you assumed perhaps that you were the only one, that yours was a specifically unusual variety of difficulty that other people would not recognize. The research suggests gently, but with considerable confidence, that you are almost certainly wrong about that. That the thing you are most reluctant to say aloud is almost certainly the thing that, if said in the right room to the right person, would produce the response that matters most. Me too. I thought it was just me. And there is something else worth naming here, something that connects the solace of shared struggle to the physical world in ways that Western psychology spent a very long time overlooking. Because the place where human beings have always gone, instinctively, when they needed to feel less alone, before the friendly societies, before the confessionals, before the therapist's office, was not another person's living room. It was outside, into the open air, into the trees, the water, the particular quality of light that exists nowhere indoors, and what the body finds there and why it finds it there turns out to be one of the most rigorously studied and persistently underappreciated stories in the whole of psychological science. In 1796, a physician named Benjamin Rush, one of the signatories of the American Declaration of Independence and the man widely considered the founder of American psychiatry, made a clinical observation that his colleagues found mildly eccentric and largely ignored for the next 150 years. He noticed that the patients in the Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia, who were assigned to work in the fields adjacent to the building, recovered faster than those who remained indoors, not marginally faster, noticeably reliably faster, faster enough that Rush documented it carefully, argued for it publicly, and recommended that the therapeutic use of outdoor labor and natural environments be formally incorporated into the treatment of mental illness. His colleagues, by and large, continued doing what they had been doing. The idea would surface again and be ignored again and surface again across the following century and a half in the tuberculosis sanatorium movement of the late 19th century, which placed patients on outdoor terraces in mountain air as a matter of standard treatment. In the shell shock rehabilitation programs of the First World War, some of which used garden work with soldiers who could no longer tolerate enclosed spaces. In the occasional hospital administrator who noticed, without quite being able to explain it, that the wards with windows overlooking greenery seemed to have better outcomes than those facing walls or parking structures. It took until 1984 for someone to design a study rigorous enough to compel the medical establishment to take any of this seriously. Roger Ulrich was an environmental psychologist at the University of Delaware, and his research question was on the surface almost absurdly simple. He examined the recovery records of patients at a suburban Pennsylvania hospital who had undergone identical gallbladder surgery between 1972 and 1981. The patients had been assigned to rooms randomly, and some of those rooms looked out onto a small stand of deciduous trees. Others looked out onto a brick wall. That was the entire variable, trees or wall. Nothing else differed. The results published in the journal Science were not subtle. Patients with the tree view had shorter post-operative hospital stays by nearly a full day on average. They requested significantly fewer doses of pain medication. The nurse's notes described them as having fewer negative evaluations and fewer instances of minor complications. They left the hospital by every measure the study could capture in better shape than the patients who had spent the same recovery period looking at brick, a view of trees. That was all. Ulrich's paper landed in the scientific literature like a quiet stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples took time to reach the edges, but they got there eventually. And in the decades since, the evidence that has accumulated around the restorative effects of natural environments has become frankly difficult to dismiss, even for people whose instinct is to be skeptical of anything that sounds like it belongs on a wellness retreat brochure. The theoretical framework that best explains what Ulrich was observing had actually been developed a few years earlier by a husband and wife team of environmental psychologists at the University of Michigan named Rachel and Stephen Kaplan. Their attention restoration theory, developed through the 1980s and published in full in their 1989 book, The Experience of Nature, made a distinction that seems obvious once you hear it, but that nobody had quite articulated before. There are, the Kaplans argued, two fundamentally different kinds of attention. The first is directed attention, the focused, effortful top-down attention that you use when you are reading a contract, navigating a difficult conversation, solving a problem under pressure, or doing anything that requires you to consciously suppress distractions and keep your cognitive resources aimed at a specific target. This kind of attention is enormously useful. It is also exhausting. It depletes, and crucially, it has no automatic off switch. The modern environment is so full of stimuli competing for directed attention that the resource gets drawn on almost continuously without the natural breaks that would allow it to recover. The second kind is involuntary attention, the soft, effortless bottom-up attention that is engaged not by effort but by interest. The attention that is captured gently and without demand by the movement of leaves in wind, by the particular patterns of light on water, by the sound of rain or birdsong, or the low rustle of a field in a light breeze. This kind of attention does not deplete directed attention. It does not compete with it. It allows it to rest, to recover, to come back after time in a natural environment, restored to something closer to its full capacity. The Kaplans identified 4 qualities that environments need to have in order to support this restoration. The first is being away the sense, even if only psychological, of having left the ordinary context of demands and obligations. The second is extent, a sense of scope and depth of being in a world rather than merely at a location. The third is fascination, the presence of effortlessly interesting features that hold attention without requiring effort. And the fourth is compatibility, the sense that the environment supports what you need rather than making demands of its own. Natural environments, the Kaplans noted, tend to possess all 4 qualities simultaneously, and to possess them in combinations that almost no built environment can replicate. This is not an aesthetic judgment. It is a functional one. The natural world was, for the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history, the only world there was. The nervous system evolved inside it. The brain's attentional systems were shaped by it. The particular quality of diffuse, softly interesting stimulation that a forest or a meadow or a stretch of coastline provides is not a novelty to the human brain. It is, in a deep evolutionary sense, home. This is essentially the argument that the biologist Edward Wilson made in his 1984 book, Biophilia, a word he coined, combining the Greek for life and for love, to describe what he believed was an innate human tendency to affiliate with other living systems. Wilson's argument was evolutionary, that humans who paid attention to the natural world, who were drawn to it, who read its signals and found it interesting, survived better than those who did not. That the aesthetic pleasure most people find in natural environments, the sense of rightness, of ease, of something settling inside the chest when you stand in a forest or on a beach, is not culturally constructed. It is ancient. It is wired in. It is the nervous system recognizing, in the most literal biological sense, where it came from. Frederick Law Olmsted understood something like this, though he would not have put it in those terms when he designed Central Park in New York City in the 1850s and 1860s. Olmsted was a landscape architect and a social reformer, and his argument for large urban parks, an argument he made repeatedly, eloquently, and in the face of considerable opposition from people who considered green space in a growing city a waste of valuable land, was explicitly about mental health. He believed, based on observation, rather than any formal research, that working-class city dwellers who had no access to natural environments suffered in ways that went beyond the physical, that the mind needed what only the natural world could provide: genuine, effortless, non-demanding respite from the relentless stimulation of urban life. He designed Central Park not as a collection of attractions, but as an immersive landscape, sweeping meadows, wooded paths, water features designed to draw the eye without demanding it. The goal, he wrote, was to produce a distinctly harmonious and tranquilizing influence upon the mind. He was in the vocabulary of the 1850s, describing exactly what the Kaplans would later call attention restoration. The park opened in 1858. It now receives approximately 42 million visitors per year, which suggests, if nothing else, that Olmsted was not wrong about what people needed. Now here is where the Japanese enter the conversation, and where the science gets specific enough to be genuinely striking. In 1982, the Japanese Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries coined a term, Shinrin-yoku. It translates approximately as forest bathing. The practice it described was not hiking, not bird watching, not any form of outdoor exercise. It was simply the act of being in a forest, walking slowly, breathing deliberately, engaging the senses without agenda, touching bark, listening, looking up through canopy, being present with the particular quality of presence that forests, for reasons partly cultural and partly biochemical, seem to facilitate. The researcher who did the most to establish the clinical basis of forest bathing was a physician and immunologist named Ching Li at the Nippon Medical School in Tokyo. Li spent years measuring the physiological effects of time spent in forest environments, and his findings were detailed and replicable enough that they eventually appeared in journals of immunology and preventive medicine, not the places you might expect to find data about trees. What Li found was this time in forest environments produced significant reductions in the stress hormones cortisol and adrenaline. It produced measurable decreases in blood pressure and heart rate. It increased the activity of natural killer cells, the immune system's frontline defense against cellular abnormality, by amounts that persisted for days after the forest visit. A 3-day trip into a forest environment produced immune changes that in some participants were still measurable a month later. The proposed mechanism behind the immune effects was a class of organic compounds called phytoncides, aromatic chemicals released by trees, particularly conifers, as part of their own biological defense systems. Breathed in sufficient quantities over sufficient time, these compounds appear to have direct immunological effects on the human body. The forest is not merely a pleasant backdrop. It is, in a biochemical sense, in conversation with you. The trees are exhaling something, and you are responding to it down to the level of your immune cells. I find this almost cosmically satisfying, the idea that a forest is not passive scenery, but an active participant in human health. That when you walk slowly through trees and feel something in you soften, it is not just metaphor. Something real and measurable is happening at the cellular level between you and the living world around you. A study from researchers at Stanford University, published in 2015, added another layer. Participants who walked for 90 minutes in a natural environment showed decreased activity in a region of the brain called the subgenual prefrontal cortex, an area associated with rumination, the repetitive self-focused negative thought patterns that are a hallmark of depression and anxiety. Participants who walked for the same amount of time on a busy urban street showed no such change. The natural environment was not merely pleasant, it was actively reducing the neural activity associated with a specific kind of mental suffering. 90 minutes in a park or a forest, measurably less rumination afterward. That is not an advertisement for anything. It is just a fact about what the human brain does when you give it what it evolved in. And yet, there is a subtlety here that I want to name, because I think it matters. Not everyone has easy access to forests or parks or the kind of sprawling natural landscape that these studies tend to use. Many people live in cities, in dense neighborhoods, in circumstances where the nearest green space is a small square of municipal lawn maintained by someone who seems to water it exclusively when it is already raining. And for most people, honestly, in the modern world, the question of how to access what nature provides is a practical one, not just a philosophical one. The research has something useful to say about this too. Studies examining the restorative effects of smaller natural elements, a potted plant on a desk, a view of a single tree through a window, the sound of a nature recording played at low volume, have found measurable effects that are smaller than those produced by full forest immersion, but real. The direction is consistent. More exposure to living natural systems in whatever form is available is associated with lower stress, lower rumination, and greater attentional recovery. The sound of rain, the particular green of a plant on a windowsill catching the light in the afternoon, the bark of a tree pressed under your fingertips for a moment on a walk to nowhere in particular. These things register. The nervous system notices. It files them quietly and without fanfare under the category of things that mean the world is living and you are part of it, and that is enough. Which brings me to something that connects to the living world in a different register entirely. Not the natural world outside you, but the social world, the world of other people, other lives, other choices about what to do with the one life each of us has been handed. Because there is a specific kind of well-being that comes not from receiving, not from rest, from nature, from touch, from shared humanity, but from giving, from choosing deliberately to extend something outward. And the psychology of that choice, why generosity feels the way it feels, what it does to the brain and the body, and why the history of kindness is far stranger and more complicated than the greeting card version suggests, is a story I have been looking forward to getting to. Kindness, it turns out, is somewhat selfish. Not in a cynical way, not in the way that makes you want to roll your eyes at yet another person trying to reduce everything beautiful about human nature to evolutionary self-interest, but in a very precise, very literal, very physiological way that I find, if anything, more interesting than the pure altruism story we usually tell ourselves. When you do something genuinely good for another person, not out of obligation, not because someone is watching, but from a real and unguarded impulse of care. Your brain does something that can be measured. It releases a cascade of neurochemicals that produce in people who have tried to describe it a sensation, not entirely unlike a mild runner's high, a warmth, a buoyancy, a feeling that researchers, when they encountered it consistently enough in their data to give it a name, called the helper's high. The person who first documented this systematically was not a neuroscientist. He was a writer and researcher named Alan Lukes, who in 1988 conducted a large-scale survey of volunteers across the United States, more than 3,000 people who regularly gave their time to help others, and asked them in careful detail how helping made them feel. What he collected was not the expected catalogue of noble sentiment. It was something more interesting, a remarkably consistent description of physical sensation. Warmth in the chest, a sudden lightening of energy, a calm that followed lasting hours or sometimes days. More than 90% of the respondents described some version of this physical response. Many said it was the primary reason they kept volunteering. Lux called it the helper's high, and the term was initially received with the mild skepticism that tends to greet anything that sounds simultaneously too good to be true and slightly too pleasant to be taken seriously as science. But the neuroscience that followed in the decades after his survey turned out to support his observations in ways that he could not have anticipated. In 2006, a team of researchers led by Jorge Moll at the National Institutes of Health used brain imaging technology to examine what happens in the brain when people make the decision to donate money to a charity as opposed to keeping it for themselves. What they found surprised them. The act of giving activated a region of the brain called the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex, a region also associated with social bonding and the experience of receiving rewards. The brain, it appeared, categorizes giving not as a sacrifice, but as a gain. The generosity circuit and the reward circuit are, at least in part, the same circuit, which raises a question that I find genuinely delightful in its implications. If being kind makes you feel good, and feeling good makes you more inclined to be kind, then the whole transaction is less like a depleting withdrawal from an account of limited goodwill, and more like a system that generates its own fuel. The more you give, the more giving feels possible. Not infinitely, exhaustion is real, and boundaries matter, but as a general direction, the direction of generosity tends to be self-sustaining in ways that the direction of withholding is not. The research that made this most concrete, the study that I keep coming back to, because of how cleanly it upends what most people assume, was conducted by the psychologist Elizabeth Dunn and her colleagues at the University of British Columbia, published in the journal Science in 2008. Dunn gave participants varying amounts of money and assigned them randomly to one of two conditions: spend the money on yourself or spend it on someone else. The specific amounts ranged from $5 to $20. At the end of the day, participants reported their happiness levels. The results were not ambiguous. The people who had spent money on others reported significantly higher happiness than those who had spent it on themselves, regardless of how much money they had been given. $5 spent on a coffee for a friend produced more reported well-being than $20 spent on yourself. Dunn and her colleagues replicated this finding across multiple countries and income levels and found that the basic direction held even in contexts of genuine material scarcity. The act of giving, it appears, is not a luxury available only to those with excess. It is a human capacity that functions across a very wide range of circumstances, and it tends to benefit the giver in ways that purely self-directed spending does not. I want to be careful about how I present this, because there is a version of this finding that gets weaponized in ways I find distasteful. The suggestion that because giving makes you feel good, you have some obligation to give, constantly, that any boundary you set is essentially selfishness dressed up in self-care language. That is not what the science says. What the science says is more nuanced and more interesting, that giving from genuine abundance, from a real and uncoerced desire to extend something outward, produces well-being. Giving from depletion, from fear, from a sense that you have no right to keep anything for yourself, does not produce the same effect. The emotional signature is entirely different, and the body knows the difference, even when the mind is trying to paper over it. This distinction brings me to someone whose life I find both inspiring and, at certain angles, quietly complicated, a man who made one of the most dramatic and costly acts of generosity in 20th century history, and whose reasons for doing so were, by his own account, not entirely what they appeared to be. Albert Schweitzer was by 1905 one of the most accomplished young intellectuals in Europe. He held doctoral degrees in both philosophy and theology. He was a concert organist of international reputation, considered one of the foremost interpreters of Johann Sebastian Bach's organ works in the world. He had written a biography of Bach that remains in print more than a century later, and a theological study of the historical Jesus that genuinely rattled the established church. He was 30 years old, he was famous, and by any reasonable external measure, his life was going extraordinarily well. And then he enrolled in medical school, not as a hobby, not as an intellectual detour. He enrolled with the intention of qualifying as a physician, and then traveling to what was then French Equatorial Africa, modern-day Gabon, to practice medicine in one of the most underserved regions on the continent. He spent the next 7 years completing his medical training while continuing to lecture, perform, and write. In 1913, he and his wife, Helene Breslau, traveled to Lambaréné, in what is now Gabon, and established a hospital in the jungle that he would work in, with interruptions for 2 world wars, during which he was interned as a German national on French territory for the rest of his life. He lived to 90 years old. He spent more than 50 of those years in Lambaréné. The standard telling of this story positions it as pure altruism, the brilliant European intellectual who gave everything up to help the suffering poor. And there is truth in that telling. But Schweitzer's own writing about his decision is more interesting and more honest than the hagiographic version allows. He wrote with the directness that characterized his thinking, that he had felt throughout his years of success, a persistent awareness that he was receiving far more from life than he was giving back to it, that the accumulation of accomplishment and recognition without a corresponding outward movement of genuine service had created in him a kind of spiritual restlessness that no amount of professional success could resolve. He was not, he wrote, doing this for the people of Gabon, though he hoped to be useful to them. He was doing it because not doing it had become intolerable. This is not the language of pure sacrifice. It is the language of someone who had discovered through private experience exactly what Dunn's research would later demonstrate experimentally, that there is a specific form of suffering that accompanies the life oriented entirely inward, that the self attended to exclusively becomes a somewhat airless place, and that the remedy for that particular suffering is not more achievement, not more recognition, not more of anything the self-directed life can offer, but the movement of something outward into the world toward other people. The philosopher Auguste Comte coined the word altruism in 1851, deriving it from the Latin alter, meaning other. He meant it as a counterweight to egoism, not its opposite exactly, but its necessary complement. A life, he argued, organized entirely around the satisfaction of the self is a life missing one of its essential dimensions. Not because selfishness is morally wrong, though he believed it was, but because the self without reference to others loses something of its own coherence. We are, he argued, constitutively social, in a way that means our own flourishing is partly dependent on the flourishing of those around us. The boundary between self-interest and other interest is at the deepest level more permeable than it appears. What I find remarkable about this argument, made in the middle of the 19th century in the purely philosophical register, is how precisely it maps onto what neuroscience has since found in the brain imaging data. The circuits for self and other are not cleanly separate. The experience of another person's suffering activates in the observer many of the same neural regions that respond to personal suffering. The experience of another person's joy activates many of the same regions that respond to personal joy. We are at the neural level more porous than the story of the bounded individual self suggests. Dasha Keltner at the University of California, Berkeley, whose research on the social emotions I find consistently illuminating, has studied what he calls the experience of awe, the feeling that arises when you encounter something that exceeds your current understanding of the world. A vast landscape, a piece of music that does something to you that you cannot explain. The sudden recognition that something much larger than your individual concerns is happening all around you all the time, whether you attend to it or not. Keltner found that the experience of awe reliably produces what he calls a shrinking of the self, a temporary loosening of the tight boundary between me and everything else. And in that loosened state, people become measurably more generous, more willing to give time, money, and attention to others, less preoccupied with their own status and advantage. The awe, in effect, briefly relocates you from the center of your own universe, which is an exhausting place to live, though it is where most of us spend most of our time, to somewhere in the middle of a larger story. And from that position, giving feels not like sacrifice, but like participation. This may be why so many of the world's wisdom traditions have placed the cultivation of awe through ritual, through contact with the natural world, through art and music and communal ceremony at the center of their practices for producing human flourishing, not as an end in itself, but as a doorway into the kind of self-forgetfulness that makes genuine generosity possible. And genuine generosity, the data now tells us, is among the most reliable pathways back to a sense of being okay. There is a finding from Sonia Lyubomirsky at the University of California, Riverside that I want to leave you with because I think it is the one that lands most personally. She asked participants to perform 5 acts of kindness per week for 6 weeks. Not grand gestures, small ones. Holding a door, writing a note, paying for someone's coffee. Simple, ordinary, costless things. At the end of the 6 weeks, the participants who had spread their 5 acts across the week showed modest increases in well-being. But the participants who had performed all 5 acts on a single day showed significantly larger gains, enough to be statistically meaningful in a study designed to detect small effects. 5 small kindnesses on one day, measurable change in how you felt about your life. The researchers' interpretation was that concentration mattered, that 5 acts spread thin across a week were easy to not notice, to slip into the background of ordinary behavior. But 5 acts on one day created something visible, a pattern, a coherent story the mind could tell itself about what kind of person it was. And that story, it turned out, was one of the most powerful things a person could have, which is in a way the perfect bridge to what comes next. Because we have been talking throughout this whole conversation about ways of being in the world, ways of resting, of connecting, of attending, of giving. But underlying all of them is something more fundamental, a question about what is actually enough, about where the line is between having and needing, between enough and more, between a life that is full and a life that is merely full of things. That question has a history, a surprisingly radical one, and the people who have answered it most convincingly are not, for the most part, who you might expect. Somewhere around 1974, an economist named Richard Easterlin published a paper that should have caused a fairly significant crisis of confidence in the way wealthy societies think about progress. It did not cause that crisis, at least not immediately. But the question it raised has never quite gone away, and the closer you look at it, the more uncomfortable it becomes. Easterlin had been examining data on income and happiness across multiple countries and across time, and he had found something that contradicted the most basic assumption of modern economic life. Within a given country at a given moment, richer people did tend to report higher levels of life satisfaction than poorer people. That part was expected. But when he looked at what happened to average happiness levels as entire countries became wealthier over time, as standards of living rose, as material circumstances improved on a population-wide scale, the happiness gains were far smaller than anyone had predicted. Sometimes they were barely detectable. In some cases, they were essentially flat. The United States had more than doubled its per capita income between 1946 and 1970. Life satisfaction by survey measures had barely moved. Easterlin called this the Easterlin paradox, and its implications are still being argued about in economics departments around the world. But the broad shape of what it suggests is not really in dispute beyond a certain threshold of material comfort, beyond the point where basic needs are reliably met and genuine scarcity is no longer a daily concern. Additional wealth does not reliably produce additional well-being. The pursuit continues. The satisfaction does not arrive. And the gap between the two is for many people in affluent societies, a source of quiet, pervasive, and surprisingly difficult to name distress. The psychologist Tim Kasser spent his career trying to understand the specific psychological mechanisms behind this paradox, and his findings collected in his 2002 book, The High Price of Materialism, were not comfortable reading for a culture that had organized itself almost entirely around the acquisition of more. Kasser found consistently across studies conducted in multiple countries and demographic groups that people who placed high value on material goals, wealth, possessions, status image, showed significantly higher rates of anxiety, depression, and interpersonal difficulty than those who did not. Not because poverty is good for the soul, it is not, and Kasser was scrupulous about making that distinction, but because the specific psychological orientation of treating external acquisition as the primary measure of a life's worth produces, in the people who hold it most strongly, a chronic and self-defeating restlessness. The materialist in Kasser's framework is not someone who enjoys nice things. It is someone for whom nice things have become the answer to a question that nice things cannot actually answer. The question of whether I am enough, whether I am safe, whether I matter. And the frustrating, almost poignant logic of that orientation is that it can never satisfy itself, because the standard against which the materialist measures sufficiency is always external, always comparative, always subject to upward revision. The goalpost moves. It has to move, because the entire system depends on the goalpost moving. An economy built on the premise of enough would look very different from the one we have. But here is what I find interesting, and what the history reveals if you go looking, is that the idea of enough as a conscious, chosen, even radical orientation toward life is not a modern invention. It is not a reaction to consumer capitalism, though it has taken that form in our era. It goes back much further, and in some of its earlier incarnations, it was not a philosophy of deprivation at all. It was a philosophy of a very specific kind of abundance. Let me take you to ancient Athens, to a garden on the outskirts of the city, sometime in the early 3rd century before the Common Era. The garden belonged to a philosopher named Epicurus, and it was, by the standards of Athenian intellectual life, a genuinely unusual place. Women were welcome there, which was almost without precedent in the philosophical schools of the era. Slaves were welcome. People of varying social classes gathered and ate together, which struck the aristocratic Athenian establishment as thoroughly improper. And what did they eat in this radical communal garden? Simple food. Bread mostly, olives, occasional cheese, water rather than wine on ordinary days. This is significant because Epicurus is one of the most systematically misrepresented philosophers in Western history. The word Epicurean, as it is used today, suggests the pursuit of luxury, fine dining, sensory indulgence, the cultivation of pleasure in its most elaborate forms. It means almost exactly the opposite of what Epicurus taught. Epicurus believed that the surest path to genuine pleasure was not its maximization, but its simplification, the careful reduction of desire to the point where desire could actually be satisfied. He wrote in one of his letters that if you wish to make a man happy, add not to his possessions, but take away from his desires. What Epicurus had noticed, with the precision of someone who had thought very carefully about what actually made people feel good, was that the pleasure of eating a simple meal when genuinely hungry is greater than the pleasure of an elaborate meal eaten without hunger. The pleasure of resting after genuine work is greater than the pleasure of rest taken as a default condition. Pleasure, in other words, is relational. It depends not just on the stimulus, but on the contrast, on the need, on the degree to which the thing that arrives actually corresponds to something that was genuinely wanted. This is why luxury pursued consistently tends to produce a kind of pleasant numbness rather than genuine happiness. The contrast disappears. The hunger is never allowed to develop, and the elaborate meal, however objectively superior, delivers less than the simple one taken at the right moment. Across the Atlantic, and about 1900 years after Epicurus, a Quaker tailor in colonial New Jersey named John Woolman arrived at something remarkably similar through a process of spiritual discernment rather than philosophical reasoning. Woolman is not a household name, which is a genuine loss, because he was one of the more remarkable moral figures in 18th century American history. He spent his adult life traveling largely on foot through the American colonies, visiting Quaker meetings, and making a single consistent, quietly radical argument that the accumulation of more than you need is not morally neutral, that the surplus possessed by some is in an interconnected economy connected to the deficit experienced by others. That simplicity is not an aesthetic preference, but an ethical one. He published his journals still in print today, still read in Quaker communities around the world, and they describe a life of such deliberate, cheerful simplicity that it reads in our context almost like science fiction. Woolman wore undyed clothing because the dyes of his era were produced using enslaved labor. He refused to accept free accommodation at houses where enslaved people worked, insisting on paying the people who served him directly. He gradually reduced his tailoring business because he found that success in business required him to produce more than people genuinely needed, and producing more than people genuinely needed seemed to him a form of harm. He did all of this not in a spirit of self-denial or moral superiority, but with what his contemporaries described as a quality of genuine lightness. He seemed, by all accounts, happy, not in a performance, just actually quietly, consistently at ease with his life in a way that the more materially successful people around him often were not. The sociologist Dwayne Elgin gave this orientation a name in his 1981 book, Voluntary Simplicity, a term that has since become the shorthand for a loose movement of people who have, for various reasons and in various ways, chosen to reduce rather than accumulate. What Elgin described, and what subsequent research on the voluntary simplicity movement has found, is that the psychological benefits of deliberate downscaling tend to be real and lasting in ways that are somewhat surprising to people who have never tried it. The people who report the highest satisfaction with voluntarily simpler lives are not people who found abundance and then gave it up as a sacrifice. They are more often people who found that simplicity gave them something that abundance had been promising and not delivering: time, attention, the feeling of actually being present in their own lives rather than perpetually preparing for a later that kept receding. Now, the Stoic technique I want to mention here is one that the philosopher Seneca, a contemporary of Emperor Nero in 1st century Rome, and one of the wealthier men of his era, which gives his philosophy of sufficiency a pleasingly ironic texture described in his letters with considerable practical specificity. The practice is called negative visualization, and it involves the deliberate temporary imagining of loss. Not as a morbid exercise and not as pessimism, Seneca was at pains to distinguish it from both, but as a method of recalibrating the attention toward what is already present. He wrote that one should set aside certain days on which to practice being content with the simplest possible fare, the roughest possible conditions, asking oneself, is this the condition I so feared? The practice, he argued, served two purposes simultaneously. It prepared the mind for genuine difficulty should it come, and it restored in the present moment the sense of gratitude for ordinary circumstances that familiarity tends to erode. The warm bed attended to, with the imagination of its absence, becomes a genuine pleasure. The ordinary meal eaten with the thought that it might not have been tastes like something. This is the mechanism that psychologists now call savoring, the deliberate conscious amplification of positive experience through attention. Bryant and Veroff at Loyola University Chicago identified it as one of the most reliable predictors of well-being in their research published in 2007, and found that it was negatively correlated with materialist orientation. People who were most focused on acquiring more tended to be least capable of savoring what they already had, which is perhaps the cruelest irony of the whole arrangement. What would it feel like genuinely to decide that what you have right now is enough, not forever, not as a permanent renunciation of anything, but just for this hour, for this evening, for the length of this conversation, which has been going for a while now, and which is drawing towards something I want to reach carefully and quietly, the way you approach the end of a long and meaningful day. Because there is one more thing, one final piece of the puzzle, the one that brings everything else into focus. Not a concept, not a piece of research, more like a recognition. The kind that arrives not when you are trying for it, but in the moments when you have finally genuinely stopped. And that is exactly where we are going now. There is a question that the philosopher William James, the father of American psychology, the man who gave us the term stream of consciousness, who spent 40 years at Harvard trying to understand what it means to be a self, carried with him for most of his adult life. He never fully resolved it, but the way he held it, the way he turned it over in his writing, with a combination of intellectual rigor and personal honesty that feels even now, more than a century later, like the work of someone genuinely alive to the difficulty of being human, that holding itself was a kind of answer. The question was simply this: what is the self actually? Not the self as a social performance, not the self as a collection of roles and responsibilities, not the self as the person your employer or your family or your culture has various opinions about, but the self in its most essential sense. The thing that persists across all the changes, across the moods and the years and the losses and the transformations, and says quietly and with some confidence, I am still here, still me, still this. James proposed in his 1890 book, The Principles of Psychology, that the self has two dimensions, which he called the I and the me. The me is the self as object, the story we tell about who we are, the accumulating biography, the narrative that connects childhood to now. The I is the self as subject, the experiencing awareness behind the story, the one who is doing the telling. And James believed, through careful introspection and decades of thinking about it, that the I, the pure experiencing awareness, is always already fundamentally at rest, that it does not change the way the story changes, that beneath all the turbulence of experience, there is something that simply witnesses, something that is not anxious, not striving, not trying to be different from what it is. He could not prove this. He was honest about that. But he had experienced it, and he thought the experience was worth reporting. I find this idea enormously comforting, and I want to be honest about why. Not because it resolves anything, but because it points towards something that all of the science we have been exploring tonight has been in its various languages trying to say, that the peace you are looking for is not somewhere you have not yet reached. It is not a product of sufficient self-improvement, or the right morning routine, or finally getting your life organized in the way that seems perpetually just around the next corner. It is something closer, something that has been there the whole time, underneath the noise, waiting with what can only be described as infinite patience for you to stop moving fast enough to notice it. The neuroscientist Matthew Walker at the University of California, Berkeley, whose 2017 book, Why We Sleep, became one of the most widely read science books of the decade, spent years studying what happens in the brain during sleep, and his findings reframed the question of rest in ways that go far beyond simple recovery. Walker found that sleep is not a passive state, it is an intensely active one. During the night, the brain cycles through stages of processing that include, crucially, a phase in which the day's experiences are transferred from short-term storage in the hippocampus to longer-term storage in the cortex, a process called memory consolidation that is, in effect, the brain's nightly editorial meeting. It reviews what happened. It decides what matters. It integrates new experience with existing knowledge, filing things, connecting things quietly, making sense of the day that has just been lived. And here is what Walker found that I think is particularly relevant to everything we have been talking about tonight. The quality of this consolidation, the richness of the integration that happens during sleep, is directly affected by the emotional state the person brings to sleep. A brain that goes to sleep in a state of high activation, high vigilance, still running the stress response from the day's events, does not consolidate as effectively as a brain that arrives at sleep already partway toward quiet. The transition matters. The winding down matters. The hour before sleep, how it is spent, what quality of attention it holds, turns out to be one of the most consequential hours of the day, neurologically speaking, precisely because it sets the conditions for everything the sleeping brain is about to do. Which means that what you are doing right now, lying here in the dark, letting the voice slow down and the thoughts go soft at the edges, is not wasted time. It is preparation. The brain you are bringing to sleep tonight is a brain that has been for some time now practicing the art of being still. And the sleep that follows that practice will do its work more completely, more deeply, more generously than the sleep that follows an evening of stimulation and noise. This is the science of coming home to yourself. And it is in the end not complicated. Every thread we have followed tonight leads here. The neuroscience of safety and the body's capacity for rest. the brain's secret life in the quiet hours, building the self while we think we are doing nothing. The small rituals that tell the nervous system it is allowed to let go. The pace of the cultures that live the longest and the lightest. The body's memory of being held and its patient willingness to be held again. The old grief that the body carries and the body's own intelligence about how to set it down. The beauty of things that do not last and the strange relief of knowing that includes the hard things. The comfort of finding your particular suffering in the faces of others. The trees outside a hospital window. The 5 small kindnesses on a single Tuesday. The enough that was always there, waiting to be recognized. All of it is pointing at the same thing. Not a destination, a direction. Inward, downward, toward the quiet. There is a Sufi poet named Rumi who wrote in the 13th century a line that has been translated so many times it has worn smooth, like a stone in a river from the handling. But the original impulse behind it is still there, still alive. He wrote out, "Beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." I have always read that as being about forgiveness, and it is partly, but I think it is also about something else, about the place beneath the noise of self-judgment and self-improvement and the relentless internal commentary that most of us have been running since approximately childhood. The field is not a metaphor for perfection. It is a metaphor for the self before all of that. The I that James was reaching toward. The experiencing awareness that simply is, without apology, without agenda, without the exhausting performance of being someone in particular. That field. You can go there. Not by achieving something, by stopping something, by putting down, even temporarily, the effort of being someone who is supposed to be somewhere other than here. You are here. That is enough for tonight. Before we arrive at the end of this particular journey together, I want to say something that I mean without any performance behind it. Thank you. Not for watching, not in the transactional way though. Of course, I am glad you are here. But for choosing this. For choosing in an evening that could have gone many other directions to spend some hours in quiet. To let yourself be told something slow and true. To stay through all of it, through the science and the history and the occasional detour into the lives of Roman emperors and Quaker tailors and Japanese tea masters and the particular stubbornness of trees. That choice says something about you, something good. If any piece of tonight landed somewhere real, if something shifted even slightly in how you are holding yourself right now compared to how you were holding yourself when you pressed play, then this conversation has done what it was supposed to do. And if you want more of this, more of the slow kind, the thoughtful kind, the kind that treats you like someone worth taking seriously, then stay close. There are more stories coming, more of the quiet history of the human mind and what it needs and what it has always known in traditions and laboratories and letters written by candlelight in rooms that no longer exist. The next one is already waiting. And now the story is done. The science has been said. The history has been told. What remains is just this. The room you are in is quieter than it was an hour ago. Your body knows things your mind has not yet caught up to. It knows the pillow, the weight of the blanket, the particular sound of the air fan, rain, the low hum of a building at rest. These things are known, safe, filed correctly under familiar. Your breath has slowed. You may not have noticed when that happened. The day is behind you now. Every difficult thing in it, every moment of effort and friction, and the small indignities that ordinary days contain, all of it is receding. Not erased, just becoming the past, which is where it belongs. The brain is beginning its quiet work. The hippocampus is already sorting, already deciding what to keep, what to integrate, what to carry forward into the person you will be when you wake. You do not have to help with that. It knows what to do. Outside, the world is continuing. It always is, at every hour, in every weather. Somewhere, it is just becoming morning. Somewhere the first light is finding the edge of a forest, moving through the trees with the particular slowness of early sun, touching the moss on the north side of the stones, catching the dew on the grass before the grass knows the day has started. And somewhere in a village, on a hillside, in a garden by a pond, in a room very much like yours, someone is also lying still, breathing, letting the night do what nights do. You are not alone in this. You never were. The field is there. Go.